She placed the last bowl of stew in front of him without a word. It was thin. It was pale. It was everything she had left in that kitchen. He stared at it, pushed it across the table, and in front of every exhausted man in that room he said it loud enough for God himself to hear, "You call that supper?" Clara Whitmore did not cry, did not argue, did not explain. She picked the bowl back up and set it down again, right in front of him, because it was her bowl, her only portion, and she had just given it away. If a story like this speaks to your heart, please subscribe to our channel and follow along until the very end, because this one does not end where you think it will. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. The summer of 1884 did not arrive gently in Holt Creek, Texas. It arrived the way all hard things arrived in that country, without warning and without mercy. The creek that gave the town its name had been dry since April. The ground had cracked open in long, pale fissures that ran through the earth like old wounds that refused to close. The mesquite trees stood without shade. The air tasted of dust and something older, something that had no name except exhaustion. Clara Whitmore had lived through 4 of those summers now. She had learned not to count them anymore. Counting only made the years feel like losses instead of evidence that she was still standing. The Whitmore boarding house sat at the edge of Holt Creek, on a stretch of road that cattle drives used when they pushed north toward the rail yards in Abilene. It was a 2-story structure of sun-bleached timber and patched over gaps where the wind came through in winter and the heat pressed in during summer. The sign above the door had faded so badly that passing riders sometimes asked if the place was still open. Clara always told them yes, because it was. Because she had decided it would be, and in her experience the things she decided with enough conviction tended to stay true even when everything else fell apart around them. She was 35 years old and had been a widow for 5 of those years. People in Holt Creek had a way of describing her that she found both accurate and unkind. They called her the woman who couldn't let go. The widow who was too proud to sell and too stubborn to ask for help. Some of the women at the church said it with something approaching admiration. Most of the merchants who extended her credit said it with something approaching pity. The difference in their voices told Clara everything she needed to know about who they actually respected and who they merely tolerated. She tolerated their opinions in return. It seemed fair. Her husband, James Whitmore, had built the boarding house with his own hands the year before they married. He had been a carpenter by trade and a dreamer by nature, and the combination had made him both wonderful and impractical in nearly equal measure. He built things beautifully and misjudged almost everything else. He misjudged the capacity of the land to yield enough for a family. He misjudged the speed at which a dry cough became something worse. He misjudged how much time he had left. He died in October of 1879 and left Clara with a boarding house, a small plot of land, $14 in a tobacco tin, and a belief she had not asked for and could not seem to put down that the place was worth saving. 5 years later, she was still trying to prove herself right. Her mornings started before the sun did. She rose at 4:30, stoked the cook fire, checked the water barrel to see how much was left from the barrel delivery she paid for every 2 weeks, and began whatever preparations the day required. If there were boarders sleeping upstairs, she kept quiet. If the house was empty, she kept quiet anyway, because the quiet had become something she was comfortable with. The way other women were comfortable with company. She did the repairs herself when she could. She had learned to set window glass, patch shingles, replace broken floorboards, and rehang doors that had swollen in the heat and stopped closing properly. She had learned which merchants in town would give her a fair price, and which ones watched her come through the door with a particular kind of attention that made her feel like inventory. She kept a ledger. She kept it carefully and honestly, which meant that on most pages the numbers told a story that was discouraging, but not yet fatal. She knew the difference. She had been to the edge of fatal twice, and had turned back both times through a combination of decisions she was proud of and luck she was grateful for, without knowing quite who to thank for it. There were things she did that no one in Holt Creek knew about. When a traveling family arrived with children who hadn't eaten since morning, and the father's expression told Clara everything she needed to know about the state of his purse, She charged him for one room and told the cook fire needed stoking anyway, so they might as well eat. She did not call it charity. She did not call it anything. She just set the plates. When a young ranch hand named Tobias came to her door 3 weeks into July with a gash on his arm from a wire fence and a fever that had been climbing for 2 days, she brought him inside, cleaned the wound, made a poultice from dried herbs she kept in a tin on the kitchen shelf, and sat with him through 2 nights until the fever broke. He had no money. She did not ask him for any. He tried to apologize for the trouble, and she told him that trouble was not something she needed him to account for. "You just rest," she told him. "We'll figure out the rest when you're well enough to stand without swaying." He had cried, which startled her. He was barely 19. She pretended not to notice. These were the things that Clara Whitmore did in the summer of 1884, while the people of Holt Creek described her as a woman who was barely holding on. She was, in fact, holding on quite a great deal. It just wasn't her own life she was holding. The morning that Ethan Callahan arrived, Clara had 11 cents to her name, a larder with a sack of beans, some salt pork, 2 onions, a small measure of cornmeal, and a jar of dried herbs. She treated the way other women treated jewelry. She had a sick young ranch hand sleeping in the back room who still wasn't eating properly, and a roof over the east section of the house that had developed a new leak. She hadn't found the money or the shingles to address. She also had standing in her kitchen, at 10:30 in the morning, Mrs. Adeline Pratt. Mrs. Pratt was not a boarder. Mrs. Pratt was a woman who considered visiting the boarding house an act of civic generosity, which meant she arrived without warning, stayed longer than welcome, and left having said at least one thing that Clara would spend the rest of the day trying not to think about. "You really ought to consider selling to Harlan Boggs," Mrs. Pratt said, setting her reticule on Clara's kitchen table, as if she owned it. "He's made a fair offer, Clara. Several of us think so." "I appreciate your concern," Clara said, not looking up from the beans she was sorting. "It isn't concern, it's practicality. You can't keep running this place alone. People are starting to talk." "People have been talking since before James was cold in the ground," Clara said pleasantly. "They'll keep talking long after I'm gone. It hasn't affected the price of beans either way." Mrs. Pratt made a sound that sat somewhere between offense and admiration. "You are the most stubborn woman in this county." "Yes, ma'am," Clara agreed. "I expect that's so." After Mrs. Pratt left, Clara stood in her kitchen and allowed herself 30 seconds of something that wasn't quite despair, but was close enough to recognize. She pressed her palms flat against the edge of the work table and breathed slowly and deliberately until the 30 seconds were finished. Then she picked up the beans and kept sorting. This was her method. She did not indulge in the feeling that things were hopeless because she had found that hopelessness was a luxury that cost more than she could afford. She could feel it at the edges, sometimes the particular weight of a life being carried alone, but she did not let it set down inside her. She kept it moving. She kept herself moving. Ethan Callahan's crew arrived at dusk. She heard them before she saw them. The sound of horses and boot leather and men's voices carrying the specific kind of exhaustion that came from weeks on the trail. Not just tired bodies, but tired spirits. The kind of fatigue that went all the way down to a man's patience and found it depleted. There were 11 of them. Clara stood on the porch and counted. 11 men, and she had food for perhaps 6 if the portions were modest, and nobody asked for seconds. She stood very still for a moment and ran the arithmetic in her head, the way she always did, quickly, quietly, without letting the result show on her face. Then Ethan Callahan stepped off his horse. She had seen men like him before. Not often, but enough times to recognize the type. He was tall and broad-shouldered with the kind of posture that came not from arrogance, but from years of being the person other people oriented themselves around. He wore his authority the way he wore his coat, easily, like something that belonged on him and required no effort to maintain. His face was weathered and dark from sun and wind, and his eyes, when they found hers across the yard, were a shade of gray that Clara associated with winter sky just before a storm. He removed his hat. "Evening, ma'am. Ethan Callahan. I trail boss for the Garland Cattle Company out of San Antonio. My crew's been on the road 6 weeks. We were told in town you take boarders." "I do," Clara said. We need beds and supper." Clara looked at the 11 men standing behind him. She looked at her hands. She looked back at him. "I can give you beds," she said carefully. "Supper may be more modest than what you're accustomed to." He studied her a moment. "How modest?" "I'll do my best," she said. "That's what I can promise." He held her gaze for a moment that lasted slightly longer than was comfortable, then nodded once. "We'll take it." What she did not say, because it was none of his business, and because she had never in her life asked a stranger to think well of her in advance, was that she had a sick boy in the back room who had eaten the last of the salt pork that morning, that she had been planning to make herself a small pot of bean soup for supper, and that 11 cattle hands represented a mathematical problem she was going to have to solve with a sack of dry beans, 2 onions, some dried herbs, and whatever prayers she could manage while the water came to boil. She went into the kitchen and she solved it. She stretched that pot of soup the way she always stretched everything, carefully, methodically, without self-pity, adding water and seasoning and time to coax out every measure of flavor the ingredients had to give. She made cornbread from the last of the meal. She set the table with what she had, which was clean and adequate, if not plentiful, and she told herself that clean and adequate was nothing to be ashamed of. The men came in from washing up and sat down, filling the boarding house with a noise and presence that Clara hadn't felt in weeks. She moved around the table efficiently, setting bowls, pouring water, answering questions about Holt Creek and the road north with the quiet confidence of a woman who had been running a public house long enough to know how to manage a room full of hungry strangers. She had kept back one bowl, one portion, because the portions when divided by 11 had turned out to be very thin indeed, and she had told herself that she wasn't hungry, which was not entirely true, but was true enough. She set it aside in the kitchen and went back out to see if anyone needed anything. Ethan Callahan was looking at his bowl. She noticed, because she noticed everything that happened at her tables. It was an occupational habit, the constant low-level tracking of a room that came from years of being responsible for the comfort of strangers. She noticed the way his spoon moved through the soup. She noticed the way his jaw tightened. She noticed the particular stillness that came over him before a man said something he hadn't quite decided to say yet. She was already turning back toward the kitchen when he said it. "You call that supper?" The room went quiet. Not all at once the quiet moved through the table in a wave, starting with the men closest to Ethan and radiating outward until every spoon had stilled and every face had turned either toward Ethan or carefully, deliberately away from Clara. She stopped. She turned back slowly because she had learned a long time ago that the speed with which a person turned around told people a great deal about whether they had been wounded. She had been wounded. She was not going to let him see it. Ethan Callahan was looking at her directly. Not with cruelty exactly. She would think about this later in the kitchen when she was alone, and had the time and the silence to parse it properly, but with the flat expectation of a man who had decided the world owed him a certain standard, and had found it lacking. His bowl sat in front of him, barely touched. "There's thin," he said, "and then there's this." Someone at the far end of the table coughed. "I understand your disappointment," Clara said. Her voice was level. She had worked for that level, was working for it still, and she did not break it. The supplies in a boarding house this far from the rail don't always match the appetite of a full cattle crew. I worked with what I have. "A man does a hard day's work," Ethan said. "He expects a meal that'll hold him through the night, not water with a bean floating in it." "Ethan." One of the older hands, a lean man with a white mustache, said his name quietly. Just the one word. Ethan did not look at him. He was still looking at Clara, and Clara was looking back at him, and she was thinking about the 11 cents in her apron pocket, and the sick boy in the back room, and the 2 onions that had gone into that pot, and the 36 hours she had been awake in the last 48, and she was thinking very clearly, in the part of her that always stayed clear no matter what, that she had 2 choices. She could explain herself. She could tell him about the empty larder and the ledger and Mrs. Pratt and Tobias and the roof and the 11 cents. She could lay it all out for him the way an accountant lays out columns, and she could watch his face move through whatever it was going to move through, and maybe it would land somewhere resembling understanding. Or she could show him. She went to the kitchen. She came back with the bowl she had set aside, the bowl she had been saving, the one portion she had kept for herself because she hadn't eaten since morning, and she was whatever else she was hungry. She walked to the table. She picked up Ethan Callahan's bowl barely touched, and she replaced it with her own. The portions were identical, thin and pale and everything she had. "That's my supper, Mr. Callahan," she said quietly. "Same as yours. If it isn't enough for you, I'm sorry. It's all there is." She picked up his bowl and walked back into the kitchen. She set it on the counter. She put both hands flat on the edge of the work table and she breathed. She did not cry. This was important to her. Not because crying was weakness, she had cried plenty of times in the past 5 years, and had come to understand that it was neither weakness nor strength. It was simply a physical fact of being a human being under pressure, but because she did not want to give the evening any more than it had already taken from her. She heard the low murmur of voices from the dining room. She heard the scrape of boots and the clink of spoons resuming. She heard someone, the man with the white mustache, she thought, say something, in a voice too low to make out, followed by a silence that had a particular quality to it. The quality of a man receiving information he did not know how to refuse. She stood in her kitchen, and she assembled the remainder of her composure, the way she assembled everything else in this house piece by piece carefully, without expecting anyone to help her. Then she went back out to collect the empty bowls, because there was always something that needed doing next, and she had found that the next thing was almost always the best cure for whatever the last thing had broken. She did not look at Ethan Callahan when she cleared his bowl, but she felt him watching her. The men retired to the room she had prepared, and Clara cleaned the kitchen in the dark because she had learned to conserve lamp oil, and she was finishing the dishes when she heard Tobias from the back room asking for water. She dried her hands and brought him a cup and sat with him for a few minutes while he drank it, checking the heat in his forehead with the back of her hand, the way she had learned to do not too much, which meant he was improving, but not gone yet, which meant another day at least. "You all right, Miss Clara?" he asked. He was watching her with the particular attentiveness of someone who was accustomed to being cared for and had developed a sensitivity for the caretaker's state as a kind of survival mechanism. "I'm fine," she said. "I heard a man's voice earlier, sounded cross." "He was tired from the trail," she said. "He'll be better in the morning." She believed this because it was the thing she needed to believe, and also because she had found that tired men and cruel men were often the same man viewed at different hours of the day, and she had made a practice of offering the benefit of the doubt because it cost her nothing, and sometimes it mattered. She helped Tobias settle back and she went back to the kitchen, and she began preparing for the morning because breakfast did not make itself, and she had 11 additional mouths to account for on a larder that had not anticipated 11 additional mouths. She was at the work table measuring out the last of her cornmeal when she heard someone on the stairs. The footstep was careful, deliberate. Not the half-awake shuffle of a man who had gotten up for water, but the measured tread of someone who was awake and knew where they were going and was trying not to disturb anyone on the way there. She did not look up. "Kitchen's closed," she said. "I'm not looking for food." The voice was Ethan Callahan's. She looked up then. He was standing in the doorway of the kitchen with his hat in his hands, which she noted because he had struck her as the kind of man whose hat was rarely in his hands. Instead of on his head, it was the posture of a man who was asking something instead of telling it. She waited. "I wanted to apologize," he said. She studied him for a moment. The lamp was low between them, and she couldn't read his expression with the kind of precision she would have preferred. He stood without shifting his weight, which meant either he was accustomed to standing still, or he had made a decision and was committed to it. "All right," she said. He frowned slightly, as if he had expected something more to push against. "That's all you've got to say." "I accepted your apology, Mr. Callahan," she said. "What else would you like me to say?" Most people say more than that when a man comes to them hat in hand in the middle of the night. Most people haven't been feeding 11 strangers on an empty larder and sitting with a sick boy since sunrise, she said, turning back to her cornmeal. "I'm a little short on conversation at the moment." There was a silence. Then, "I walked the house a bit. Couldn't sleep. She did not respond. I saw what you did for the boy in the back room. She measured the cornmeal, set the measure aside, started on the dried beans she would need to soak before dawn. I saw your ledger on the table in the hall, he said. She stopped. She turned to face him fully now. That ledger is private business. It was open, he said. I didn't read it long enough. He paused. Clara Whitmore, you've been running this house alone for 5 years. You didn't read that in the ledger. No. I asked Billy, the older fellow, my second. He's passed through Holt Creek before. He knew your name. She looked at him steadily. Then you already had your answer before you came down here. The answer I had was facts, he said. I came down here because facts aren't the same as understanding. She held his gaze for a moment that stretched long enough to mean something, though she wasn't yet sure what. It's late, Mr. Callahan, she said. My crew leaves at first light, he said. I wanted you to know before we go that what I said at the table tonight was the act of a man who hadn't been looking at things clearly. I was tired, and I took it out on the only person in the room who hadn't done a single thing to earn it. He stopped. His jaw worked once, as if he were chewing something hard. That's not a thing I'm proud of, ma'am. It won't happen again. See that it doesn't, she said quietly. He almost smiled. It was small and not quite finished, but it was there. Yes, ma'am, he said. He started to turn. Mr. Callahan. He stopped. She looked at the work table. She looked at the sack of beans in her hand. She had not planned to say anything further and was not entirely certain why she was about to. The stew wasn't good, she said. I know that. I've made better with less, but tonight it wasn't good. I wanted you to know I'm aware of that. I'm not asking you to pretend otherwise. He turned back slowly. He was watching her with a kind of attention she wasn't accustomed to, not assessment, not pity, something more considered than either, like a man who was listening not to the words, but to what the words were covering. It fed 11 men, he said, after a 6-week drive. He paused. I've been in cattle camps where the cook had a full wagon of supplies and produced worse. That's a very kind thing to say, she said. You don't have to say it. No, ma'am, he agreed. I don't. She looked at him. He looked at her. The lamp between them was burning very low, and the kitchen was quiet, except for the settling of old timber and the distant sound of one of his horses shifting in the yard. Your crew leaves at first light, she said finally. Yes, ma'am. A pause. I'm not going with them. She stared at him. I beg your pardon. I'm not leaving with my crew tomorrow. Her hands went still on the beans. Why not? Ethan Callahan looked at her the way a man looks at something he has been working out in his head for some time and has finally arrived at with the kind of certainty that doesn't leave much room for debate. Because I owe you something, he said. And because there's work here that needs doing, and I'm a man who knows how to do it. And because... He stopped. He looked at the patched wall above the work table. He looked back at her. Because I walked through this house tonight, and I saw what one woman is carrying on her own, and I said something at your table that made it worse instead of better, and I don't walk away from debts. This isn't your debt, she said. What you said was unkind, but I don't require payment for unkindness. I require it to not happen again. And the roof, he said. The east section. 3 shingles gone at least, maybe more. I could see the stars through it from the hallway. She was quiet. And the fence post on the south side is rotted through at the base, he said. And your well rope is fraying about a foot above the bucket. It'll snap inside a week. He paused again. I noticed things, ma'am. Walking around a house in the dark gives a man time to notice things. Mr. Callahan. Miss Clara? His voice was quiet, but it had a quality in it that she recognized from her own voice on occasions when she had decided something and needed someone else to understand that the deciding was done. I'm a fair hand with a hammer, and I work hard, and I eat modest. I'll stay through the repairs and pay for my board with labor, and then I'll be on my way. You don't have to like me. You don't have to talk to me outside of what's necessary. but I'll not leave this house worse than I found it, not after what I did at your table tonight." Clara looked at this man who had come to her boarding house tired and difficult, and had eaten her last bowl of food, and insulted her in front of a room full of witnesses, and then spent the night walking through her house in the dark, cataloging her deficiencies, not to use them against her, but to understand what he owed her for them. She did not trust him. She was not sure she liked him. She was not sure in this moment what she felt about any of it, except that there was something in his stillness that did not feel like a performance, and something in his voice that did not have the particular softness of a man who was asking for something, while pretending he was giving it. "The roof is the most urgent," she said finally. "The leak is getting worse." "I'll start there," he said. "You'll start after breakfast," she said, "and you'll eat what I put in front of you without comment." He looked at her for a moment, and this time the thing that crossed his face was unambiguous. It was respect. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I will." She turned back to her beans. "Good night, Mr. Callahan." "Good night, Miss Clara." He was gone. His footsteps quiet on the stairs, and Clara stood in her kitchen in the low light and held the sack of beans in both hands and did not think about what had just happened, because she had found that thinking about things at midnight produced nothing useful, and sometimes produced things that were actively harmful. She soaked the beans. She banked the fire. She went upstairs to her room and lay on her bed, still dressed, because she would need to be up in 3 hours, and changing seemed like a waste of the time in between. She looked at the ceiling in the dark. Somewhere above her there was a hole in the roof. She thought about a man walking through her house in the dark, counting her broken things, not to judge her, to understand what he owed her. She closed her eyes. She did not sleep easily, but she slept, and for the first time in a very long time, she felt something shift inside her, something quiet and cautious, and not quite ready to be named. Something that felt almost like the possibility that tomorrow might be different from today. Clara was up at 4:15. She had not slept well, but she had slept enough, and she had learned long ago that enough was a number worth being grateful for instead of mourning what it wasn't. She dressed in the dark, pinned her hair back without looking at it, and went downstairs to start the fire. The kitchen was cold, the way kitchens get cold in West Texas. Summer nights, not the cold of winter, but a dry, hollow coolness that evaporated the moment the sun remembered what it was doing. She stoked the coals she had banked the night before, and added wood, and stood over the growing flame for a moment, letting it warm her hands. The beans she had soaked were ready. She started them on the fire and went to check on Tobias. He was sleeping, which was good. His forehead, when she pressed the back of her hand to it, was warm, but not hot, which was better. She adjusted the thin blanket over his shoulders and let him sleep, and went back to the kitchen to start the cornbread. She had 11 men to feed breakfast. She had beans cornmeal, a piece of fatback she had found in the very back of the larder behind a jar of pickled okra she had forgotten about, and 4 eggs from the 2 hens she kept in the small coop behind the house. She stood at the work table and divided this into portions in her head, the same way she had divided the night before, quietly without drama, with the arithmetic precision of a woman who had been making nothing into something for long enough that it had stopped feeling like a miracle and started feeling like skill. She was shaping the cornbread into the pan when she heard boots on the stairs. One set, measured and deliberate. She did not look up. Ethan Callahan appeared in the kitchen doorway at 20 minutes before 5 in the morning, fully dressed, hat in hand, with the expression of a man who had also not slept particularly well and had reached some conclusions about it. "Coffee?" she asked. "Please," he said. "Can I do anything?" She looked at him. She had not expected that. Men who stayed at the Whitmore boarding house did not, as a general rule, come into her kitchen before dawn and ask if they could help. They came in when the food was ready and sat down and ate it. "You can split wood," she said. "Stacks behind the house. I'll need more for the morning fire and probably for noon, if you and your crew are still here for midday." "My crew leaves at sunup," he said. "I told Billy last night." "And what did Billy say?" Ethan almost smiled. He said I'd lost my mind. Smart man, Clara said. He's been saying it for 12 years. He's right about half the time. He took the cup she held out toward him and wrapped both hands around it. I'll get the wood. He was outside before she had finished the thought. She'd been about to think about him, which she found mildly disorienting. She was not accustomed to people who did what they said they were going to do in the same breath they said it. By the time the sky outside the kitchen window had gone from black to the particular shade of dark blue that preceded dawn, she could hear the steady rhythm of an axe striking wood in the yard. Even and unhurried. The kind of rhythm that came from a man who had been doing a thing long enough that his body knew how to do it without being asked. She cooked. The men came down one by one as the smell of food reached the rooms above. Not Clara's best meal, she knew that plainly, but hot and filling, which was what a trail crew needed and what she had been able to provide. She moved between the kitchen and the dining table, the way she always moved through the boarding house efficiently and without particular feeling about it. Refilling cups, answering questions about the road north, accepting a comment from a young hand about the cornbread being the best he'd had since his mother's with the quiet thanks it deserved. Billy, the older man with the white mustache who had said Ethan's name at the table the night before, sat at the near end of the table and watched her with an attention that was different from the other men's attention. Not impolite. Thoughtful in the way of someone assembling information they hadn't asked for and weren't sure what to do with yet. When she refilled his coffee, he said, he meant what he said, about staying. I know, Clara said. He doesn't do things halfway, Billy said. Never has. Whatever he told you he was going to do. He stopped and turned his cup in his hands. He'll do it. He told me he'd fix my roof, Clara said. Billy looked at her steadily. Then you'll have the best roof in Holt Creek. She didn't answer that. She took the coffee pot back to the kitchen and came back out for the empty bowls. Ethan came in from the yard as the men were finishing stacked 3 days' worth of split wood against the kitchen wall without being asked, and sat down at the far end of the table and ate what she set in front of him without a word. Not conspicuously silent. Not the silence of a man performing penance, just the ordinary quiet of someone eating and thinking and not requiring anything of the people around him. She noticed that he ate every bite. The crew left at sunup the way Ethan had said they would. Billy was last out the door, and he paused on the porch and looked back at Clara in a way that seemed to be trying to communicate something he hadn't decided how to put into words. He's a decent man, Billy said finally. He's just... A pause. He's been the boss a long time. He forgets to look at things from the bottom up. Most people who've been on top for a long time do, Clara said. Billy turned his hat in his hands. Yes, ma'am. That is exactly right. He settled the hat on his head. You need anything at all, you send word to the Garland Company in San Antonio. They'll get it to me. I'll remember that, she said. She watched the crew ride out, and then turned around to find Ethan standing in the yard with a ladder she did not recognize propped against his shoulder, and a look on his face that suggested the roof was already the next problem he had arranged himself in front of. Where did you get the ladder? She said. Borrowed it from your neighbor down the road, the man with the gray mule. Mr. Hendricks. He said to tell you his wife's preserves did well this year, and she'll send a jar over when she gets a chance. Clara stared at him. You knocked on Mr. Hendricks' door at 5 in the morning. 6, Ethan said. He was already up. You spoke to my neighbor about my roof before you'd eaten breakfast. I walked the outside of the house while I was splitting wood, Ethan said, as if this were a perfectly ordinary sequence of events. The east section is worse than I thought from inside. You've got 5 shingles gone, not 3, and the flashing around the chimney is pulling away. Left another season, it'll take the whole upper corner. He looked at her steadily. I told you I'd start with the roof. I started with the roof. Clara opened her mouth and then closed it. She did not have the words for what she was feeling, which was not gratitude exactly and not irritation exactly, but something in between that had no name she knew of. She had spent 5 years being the person who identified problems and figured out how to address them, and did the addressing mostly alone, and here was a man who had appeared in her dining room 12 hours ago and insulted her stew, and was now standing in her yard with a borrowed ladder and a full assessment of her structural deficiencies. "I'll need to go to the hardware in town," he said. "For shingles and flashing material. Do you have any credit there?" "With Gus Mercer?" she said. "Some. Not much. I'll pay for the materials." "You will not." He looked at her. Not impatiently, but steadily, the way a man looks at an argument he has already thought through. "Miss Clara, I'm not doing this to make you feel beholden. I'm doing it because I said something at your table that I shouldn't have said, and your roof is leaking, and I'm a man who knows how to fix roofs. Those three things together seem to indicate a fairly clear course of action. My roof is not your responsibility." "No, ma'am," he agreed. "It isn't. But making it right is." He paused. "There is a difference." She looked at him for a long moment, under the early morning sky, with the smell of the cook fire still in her hair, and the knowledge of 11 cents in her apron pocket, and the full weight of what he was and wasn't offering pressing on her from both sides at once. "I'll allow the materials," she said finally. "That's all. The rest you work off against room and board." Something in his face settled, like a thing that had been held tense releasing. "That's fair," he said. "I wasn't asking you if it was fair, Mr. Callahan. I was telling you the terms." The corner of his mouth moved. "Yes, ma'am." He went to town for materials, and Clara went inside and sat with Tobias for half an hour while he ate a proper breakfast for the first time since he'd come to her door. And she listened to him talk about the ranch where he worked, and the boss who'd sent him off with $4 and a wave when the wound went bad, and hadn't asked after him since, and she said nothing about this because her opinion of the ranch boss in question would not help Tobias heal any faster, and would only upset him. "You think I can ride in 2-3 more days?" Tobias asked. Clara considered him honestly. His color was better. The arm was still tender, but the swelling had come down considerably. 3 days minimum," she said. "And you ride easy. No roping, no lifting fence posts, nothing that'll pull on that arm until it's had another week to close properly." "Boss won't like that," Tobias said. "Your boss can come speak to me about it," Clara said pleasantly. Tobias looked at her with something that was almost amusement. "You'd tell him straight." "I would tell him that a hand who loses the use of his arm because he went back to work before he healed is worth considerably less than a hand who takes 3 extra days and comes back whole. I would phrase it in the terms most likely to reach him." Tobias laughed, which was the best sound she had heard in that back room since he'd arrived. She was washing the breakfast dishes when she heard the wagon come back into the yard, and then the sounds that followed were particular and orderly. The sounds of a man who knew how to work, and was working. The scrape of the ladder against the eave. The careful footsteps on the roof slope. The measured tap of a hammer locating the problem before the heavier strikes began to address it. The sound was unfamiliar. Clara stood at her kitchen sink and listened to it, and found that she did not know what to do with the feeling it produced, which was something in the vicinity of relief, but complicated by the awareness that relief when it came from outside herself, instead of from her own efforts, tended to be temporary, and to leave things worse when it went than they had been before it arrived. She had learned this from James. Not because James had been a bad man. He had been a good man who died too soon, and the grief of losing him was something she had worked through with the thoroughness she brought to everything. What she had not entirely worked through was the specific shape of the absence. He left the absence of having someone else to rely on to think with, to hand the hammer to when her arms were tired. She had learned to not need that. Learning to not need something was a different thing from not wanting it, and she had learned to live with the difference without making too much of it. She rinsed the dishes. She dried them. She went to check the larder and start planning for midday, because she had 11 cents and a man who was apparently going to be staying long enough that she needed to figure out the math of feeding him. And the math of feeding him would require going into town herself. And going into town would require having a conversation with the merchant she owed money to about extending her credit, which was a conversation she disliked having and had now had 3 times this year. She was putting on her bonnet to go to town when she heard the hammer stop. Then she heard Ethan's boots on the ladder. Then on the porch. Then at the kitchen door. She turned. He had sawdust on his shirt, and his hair was damp under the brim of his hat, and he was holding a piece of rotted roof timber in one hand, with the expression of a man who has found the bad news hiding inside the news he already had. "How much worse?" she said. "Two of the joists under the east section," he said. "Rotted through at the ends where the water's been getting in. The shingles are the symptom. The joists are the problem." She sat down. She didn't intend to. Her legs simply made the decision without consulting the rest of her, and she sat in the kitchen chair nearest to her and looked at the rotted piece of wood he was holding, and did the arithmetic in her head, which took approximately 4 seconds, and produced a result that was not compatible with 11 cents. "How much?" she said. "For the lumber, probably $6, maybe $7. He set the rotted piece on the table between them. He was watching her with that careful attention she was getting accustomed to, which did not make it more comfortable. "It could wait another season if you tied the shingles down tight," he said. "But it would be lying to call it anything other than waiting for it to get worse." "I know," she said. "Miss Clara." "Don't," she said. He stopped. She looked at the piece of rotted wood. She looked at her hands. She thought about the ledger on the hall table that he had seen the night before, the columns she kept so faithfully, the numbers that told the truth about the state of things with a precision that she found both useful and occasionally devastating. "I have 11 cents, she said. She had never said that to a person before. Not to Mrs. Pratt, not to Gus Mercer at the hardware, not to anyone. She had always found a way to frame it differently. The supplies were running thin, the season had been difficult. She was managing words that described the same fact without being the fact. She didn't know why she said it to him. Maybe because he had already read her ledger. Maybe because she was tired. Maybe because there was something in his face that was not pity, and she had found that the absence of pity made honesty easier. Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Harlan Boggs," he said. "The man who wants to buy this place. He's been putting pressure on you." Clara's head came up. "Where did you hear that name?" "Gus Mercer mentioned him when I was at the hardware," Ethan said. "Said Boggs has been making offers on properties along this road. Said you'd turned him down twice." He paused. Gus seemed to think that was either very brave or very foolish and couldn't decide which. "It was neither," Clara said. "It was a decision. I built something here. I'm not selling it to a man who wants to put up a freight company warehouse." "What does he offer?" "Less than it's worth," she said. "Every time. And if the roof fails," she looked at him directly, "then I rebuild it. Or I don't rebuild it, and I figure out the next thing. But I don't sell to Harlan Boggs." Ethan held her gaze. She expected him to argue with her, expected the particular kind of practical logic that men deployed when they thought a woman was making an emotional decision about a financial matter. She had heard it from the banker. She had heard it from the minister. She had heard it from her brother-in-law, who had come all the way from Galveston once to give her a version of it that lasted 2 hours. Ethan said, "Then we fix the joists." She blinked. "I'll advance the lumber cost against my own account," he said. "You can work it out of the board over time, or not, that's between you and what you decide later. But the house needs the work now, and I'm here now, and we're not selling it to Boggs." The way he said, "we," as if he had been here 5 years, as if he had any standing to say it at all. She should have corrected him. She knew that plainly with the part of her mind that kept a ledger on the human transactions as well as the financial ones. A woman in her position did not let a stranger say "we" about her property without redirecting it clearly and immediately. She did not redirect it. "Why?" she said instead. "Why what? Why does it matter to you? You drove cattle here from San Antonio. You don't know me. You don't know this house. You said something unkind at my table and you apologized for it, which is more than most men would have done. That's a clean account. You don't owe me joists." Ethan set the piece of rotted timber down on the table. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down in it, which she had not expected, and looked at her with an attention that was entirely direct, and had nothing in it that she could use as a reason to look away. "My mother," he said, "ran a boarding house in Laredo for 11 years after my father died. I was 9 when he went, old enough to carry wood. Not old enough to be much other use." He paused. "I watched her do what you do, every single day. And I watched the men who came through that house treat her like the tablecloth something useful and mostly invisible." Clara did not move. "I became one of those men," he said, "over time, without noticing it happening." He looked at the rotted timber. "Sat down at your table last night and saw a tired woman with thin soup and thought about what I didn't have instead of what it cost someone to give it to me." He looked back at her. "I saw my mother in your face when you put that bowl in front of me, after I said what I said." He stopped. "That's not something a man walks away from." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, one of Clara's hens made a sound in the coop. The fire settled in the stove. "You don't have to save me to make up for not saving her," Clara said, gently but clearly. "No, ma'am," he agreed. "That's not what I'm doing." He didn't elaborate. She thought about pushing on it. She thought about the 12 different ways she could analyze his motives with the sharpness she brought to most things and come up with reasons to distrust them. She thought about the ledger of human transactions and what the numbers showed. Instead, she said, "Lumber yards on the north side of town. Tell them Clara Whitmore sent you, not Garland cattle." Something shifted in his face. "My name," she said. "Not yours." "Yes, ma'am." He stood. He picked up his hat. "I'll be back before noon." He left. Clara sat in the kitchen alone and listened to the wagon pull out of the yard and told herself that she was not thinking about what he'd said about his mother and that she was not rearranging any of her previously held positions about reliable people, and that the feeling that had been sitting in her chest since about 4 o'clock this morning was not anything that required examination. She was not entirely convincing to herself, but she picked up and got on with the day because that was what she did. Tobias appeared in the kitchen doorway around 9, upright and careful, holding his arm close to his side and wearing the expression of a man who had decided to be well through sheer determination. "I smell coffee," he said. "Sit down before you fall down," she told him. He sat. She poured. He wrapped both hands around the cup the same way Ethan had, and she noted this without knowing what to do with the noting. "Who was that man?" Tobias asked. "Heard him on the roof this morning." "A boarder." Tobias looked at her over his cup. He was 19, but he had old eyes, the kind that came from a childhood where paying attention was a survival skill. "He's fixing your roof." "He is." "You let a stranger fix your roof." "He's working for board," she said. "It's a straightforward arrangement." Tobias was quiet for a moment. Then, "He the one that said something last night at supper?" Clara looked at him. "I heard," Tobias said simply. "Back room's not that far." "Yes," she said. "He is." Tobias looked down at his coffee. "And you're letting him stay?" "I'm letting him repair what's broken," she said. "Those are not the same thing." Another silence. Then Tobias said very quietly, "Miss Clara, you fed me for 10 days and didn't ask me for a cent. You sat with me 2 nights when the fever was bad. You told me I didn't have to apologize for being sick." He stopped. "You got a way of letting people in when you think you ain't doing it." Clara looked at him steadily. "Tobias." "Yes, ma'am." "Drink your coffee." He drank his coffee, but he was smiling. The morning moved forward. Clara went into town herself around 10 because there were things she needed that required her presence, and not a proxy, and because she had learned that avoiding Holt Creek for too long produced the same effect as avoiding any other thing that made her uncomfortable. It got worse. She went to Mercer's Hardware first. Gus Mercer was a lean, careful man of about 60 who had extended her credit 3 times in the past year and never once made her feel badly about it, which was a quality she valued above most others in a merchant. He had the kind of quiet decency that didn't announce itself, which she found far more reliable than the kind that did. "Mr. Callahan came in this morning," he said as she came through the door. "I know," she said. "He bought shingles and flashing material." Gus paused. "Put it on the Garland account." Clara stopped. "I told him to use my account. Gus looked at her with the particular expression of a man who is delivering a message that is not his and is not sure how it will land. He said, "And I am giving you this word for word. Miss Clara, he said to tell you that the materials were purchased in settlement of a debt already owed, and that the credit arrangement you wanted to establish could begin with the next purchase." She stood very still. He also, Gus continued with the tiniest movement at the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile, bought 2 sacks of flour, a side of bacon, dried beans coffee, and a 10-pound sack of cornmeal, which he also put on the Garland account, and asked me to set them aside for you to collect. Clara counted to 5 internally. "He had no authority to do that," she said. "He said you'd say that," Gus said. "He also said to tell you." Gus picked up a folded piece of paper from the counter and held it out to her. "He wrote it down. He said you'd prefer it in writing." She took the paper. She unfolded it. The handwriting was clear and unexpectedly careful. "Miss Clara, the groceries are not charity and not a gift. They are an acknowledgement that a woman who has been feeding everyone else's need while her own pantry ran empty has been running a substantial deficit that the universe in general has failed to address. Consider it a correction. E. Callahan." She read it twice. She folded it. She put it in her apron pocket. "I'll take the supplies," she said. Gus Mercer's not-quite smile won the battle against his restraint. "Yes, ma'am." She was loading the wagon when she heard her name from across the street. Harlan Boggs. He was a wide, prosperous-looking man of 50 or so, with the kind of face that had once been handsome and had since become merely confident. He wore his money the same way he wore his suit as information about himself that he assumed everyone found interesting. He crossed the street toward her with his hands in his coat pockets and his chin at the angle men held it when they were about to say something they had already decided in advance. "Miss Clara, I heard you had a crew come through last night. Large one." "I did," she said. "Heard one of them stayed on." News in Holt Creek moved faster than weather, which was saying something. "That's right. Trail boss, they're saying. Man named Callahan." He paused, letting the information sit between them, the way a card player lays down a hand. "Interesting." "He's working for board," Clara said. "Roof repair." Boggs rocked on his heels. "You know, Clara, the offer I made you last spring is still open. I've kept it open as a courtesy. Things being what they are with the boarding house." "My boarding house is not for sale," she said. "I'm going to put a freight terminal on that stretch of road inside 2 years, he said, pleasantly. "Absolutely. The traffic will come to me, not to a boarding house. The kind of people who travel that road going forward won't be looking for home cooking and a clean bed. They'll be looking for speed and efficiency." He smiled at her. "I'm not trying to hurt you, Clara. I'm trying to make you a fair offer before the market makes it for me." Clara looked at him. She had known Harlan Boggs for 4 years. She had decoded him inside the first 4 minutes and hadn't needed to revise her assessment since. He was not a cruel man. Cruelty required a quality of attention to the other person that he did not extend to anyone he had already calculated as less useful than himself. He was simply a man who had decided that the future belonged to him and was arranging the evidence to support the conclusion. "When the freight terminal comes," she said, "I'll adjust my business accordingly. Until then, my answer is the same as it's always been." She picked up the last sack of cornmeal and set it in the wagon bed. "Good day, Mr. Boggs." She climbed up onto the bench and released the brake and drove back toward the boarding house. And she did not look back at Harlan Boggs standing in the street behind her, because she did not look back at things she had already decided about. But her hands were tight on the reins. Because 2 years was a number she hadn't had before. And 2 years laid against a leaking roof and rotted joists, and 11 cents was a number that required thinking about. She was thinking about it when she turned into the yard and found Ethan Callahan on the ground beside the well, not on the roof, with the well rope laid out in front of him, and a new coil of rope beside it, and the expression of a man who has moved from one problem to the next without stopping to consult anyone about the transition. She pulled the wagon to a stop. "I thought you were fixing the roof," she said. "I am fixing the roof," he said. I ran out of flashing nails and the rope snapped while I was up there. Came down to replace it before someone drew a bucket of water and lost it." He looked up at her. "I'll go back for the nails this afternoon." She sat on the wagon bench and looked at him kneeling beside her well, with a new rope in his hands, and the afternoon light coming at a low angle across the yard, and she thought about what Tobias had said that morning, about the way she let people in without noticing she was doing it. She thought about 2 years in a freight terminal, and a man named Boggs, who was absolutely correct about the direction the road was going. She thought about a note in her apron pocket that said the word correction in careful handwriting. "Boggs spoke to me in town," she said. Ethan's hand stilled on the rope. He looked up at her. "He says he's putting a freight terminal on this road inside 2 years," she said. "He says the traffic will come to him." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Is he right?" he asked. "Probably," she said. "About the terminal. About the traffic." She paused. "Not about my answer." He held her gaze from where he was kneeling beside the well, and she held his from the wagon bench above him, and between them was everything she had not said, and everything he had not asked, and the afternoon light, and the well rope, and the sound of one of her hens making an opinion known in the coop behind the house. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "I'm going to unload these groceries," she said. "Then I'm going to think about it." She climbed down from the wagon. He got up and came to help with the groceries before she had formulated the words to refuse the help, which meant she did not refuse it, which meant they carried 2 sacks of flour and a side of bacon and a 10-pound sack of cornmeal into her kitchen together. And he set his sacks on the work table, and she set hers beside them, and they stood on either side of her kitchen with the supplies between them. "Thank you," she said, "for the groceries. I'm not glad you did it without my permission, but She stopped. She found the precise word and used it. "I'm grateful." "You're welcome," he said, simply, without making more of it. That simplicity undid something small in her chest that she had not known was held tight. "Mr. Callahan," she said, "what happened last night with the cattle, the drive north, the Garland Company? Does someone expect you somewhere?" He leaned against the kitchen door frame. "I send word with Billy. Garland's known me 15 years. They'll wait. And when they stop waiting, then I find another outfit." He said it without hesitation. Not dramatically, just as a fact about the world. "Miss Clara, I'm not here because I have nowhere else to be. I'm here because this is where I should be." He paused. "I'll stay until the work is done. That's the truth. What the work turns out to be." He looked at the patched wall above the work table, then back at her. "That might take a little longer to determine than either of us expected." She looked at him for a long time. She was a woman who had learned to read people early and accurately because her survival had often depended on the reading. She read him now with the same care she read the ledger, systematically looking for the number that didn't add up the column that came out wrong. She didn't find it. She didn't know what to do with not finding it. "Supper's at 6, she said, "the same as it was last night, except the larder isn't empty anymore, so it'll be better." He nodded. "And Mr. Callahan," he paused in the doorway. "The next time you buy something and put it on my name without asking me first," she said, "I'll send it back to the store and charge you for the delivery." He looked at her. That corner of his mouth moved again, the almost smile she was developing a reluctant familiarity with. "Yes, ma'am," he said. He went back out to the well. Clara stood in her kitchen with a full larder for the first time in 4 months, and a note in her apron pocket, and a man in her yard who had arrived 36 hours ago as a problem, and had continued stubbornly, and without her authorization, to become something she could not yet name. She started supper, and the sound of the hammer on the roof came steady and even above her head, and the fire was warm, and the kitchen smelled like coffee and bacon, and something she had almost forgotten. The name of something that had lived in this house before. The years got lean in the time when James was alive, and the rooms were full, and the future felt like an open road instead of a reckoning coming down the pike. She let herself feel it for exactly as long as it took to season the beans. Then she put the lid on the pot and set it to simmer and got on with the rest of it. Because supper wasn't going to make itself, and neither was tomorrow. And she had learned a long time ago that the best way to meet the future was to have something good on the stove when it arrived. The roof was finished by Thursday. Clara knew this because she woke that morning to silence where there had been hammering for 3 days, and the silence had a different quality than the usual quiet of the boarding house. It was the silence of something completed rather than something waiting. She was at the kitchen table with her ledger when Ethan came in from outside, set his hammer on the counter, and poured himself coffee without asking which he had started doing on the second day and which she had decided not to address because the alternative was having a conversation about it, and she had other things to do. "It's done," he said. "I noticed," she said. East section joists, new shingles flashing reseated around the chimney. He sat down across from her with his coffee. "It'll hold 10 years if you keep an eye on the chimney flashing after hard rain." "I know how to keep an eye on a chimney," she said. "I know you do," he said. "No edge in it. Just a statement." She looked at her ledger. She looked at him. "The fence post on the south side." He nodded. "I was going to ask about that. And the barn door hinge, the top one. It's pulling away from the frame." "I saw it. And the step on the back porch, second one from the top. Someone's going to go through it." Ethan set his coffee down. He looked at her with the expression of a man who is recalibrating something. "Miss Clara, how long have you had that list?" "Which list?" "The one you're reading from in your head." She met his eyes. "About 3 years," she said. Something moved across his face that was not quite amusement and not quite something else. "All right," he said. "Fence post today. Barn hinge tomorrow. Porch step after that." "There are 11 more things after the porch step." "Then I'd better not waste time sitting here," he said. He picked up his coffee, finished it standing, and went back outside. Clara looked at the empty chair where he'd been sitting. She looked at her ledger. She wrote down the date and the completed roof repair in the column where she tracked improvements to the property and the number she put beside it. The estimated value of the labor was one she had calculated carefully and honestly, and it was not a small number, and looking at it produced a feeling she did not examine too closely. Tobias left on Friday. He came to find her in the kitchen the morning he was well enough to ride hat in hand. His arm still in the sling she had made him from a pillowcase she couldn't afford to spare, and had spared anyway. And he stood in the kitchen doorway, looking like a man who had something important to say, and not enough words for it. "Miss Clara," he started. "You're going to be fine," she said. "Keep the arm still another week. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." "Yes, ma'am." He paused. "I don't have any money to Tobias." He stopped. "You get well," she said. "That's what you owe me, nothing else." He nodded once, sharp and hard, the way young men nodded when emotion came at them faster than they knew what to do with, and they needed to meet it with something solid. He started to turn. Then he turned back. "That man," he said. "Callahan." "What about him?" Tobias looked at her carefully. "He came by the room last night, after supper. Asked how I was doing. Asked where I worked, which outfit, how long." He paused. "Asked if they'd treated me right." Clara was still. "I told him about getting sent off with $4 when the arm went bad," Tobias said. "He asked me the name of the outfit." "And you told him?" "He had a way of asking." Tobias looked at the floor, then back up at her. "You think he's going to do something about it?" Clara thought about the man who had walked through her house in the dark, cataloging what needed fixing, who had driven to town and bought groceries and written a note about corrections, who had looked at a freight terminal threat and said, "We're not selling to Boggs," as if he had been here 5 years instead of 3 days. "I think," she said carefully, "that Ethan Callahan does not ask questions he doesn't intend to do something with the answer to." Tobias absorbed this. "Good," he said quietly. Then he left. She watched him ride out from the kitchen window, and she thought about what he'd said. And then she set the thought aside in the part of her mind where she kept things she wasn't ready to examine yet, and she went back to the biscuits she was making, because the morning wasn't going to wait for her to finish thinking. The first person from town came that afternoon. She was hanging laundry when she heard the gate, and she turned to find Margaret Hale standing in the yard. Margaret ran the dry goods store with her husband, and was the kind of woman who had a genuine warm heart and a genuine inability to leave well enough alone, which meant she could be both the most useful and the most exhausting person in a room, depending on which part of her was operating at any given moment. "Clara," she said, looking past her toward the barn where the sound of a hammer had started up again. "Is it true a trail boss is doing your repairs?" "A boarder is doing repair work for his room," Clara said. "Same as it sounds." "People are saying—" Margaret stopped, started again. "There's some talk is all." "There's always some talk, Margaret. It's never stopped the sun coming up." "Clara!" Margaret lowered her voice as if the hammer 40 yards away might hear her. "Reverend Marsh said that a woman in your position ought to be careful about how things look." Clara clipped a sheet to the line. "Reverend Marsh," she said, "has not spent 5 years keeping this house running on what falls between the floorboards. When he has, I'll give his opinions about my position more weight." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Do you like him?" she asked. Different tone, genuine now. Clara looked at her. "He fixed my roof," she said. Margaret searched her face with the focused attention of a woman who had known Clara Whitmore for 4 years and could read her silences the way some people read print. "Clara Jane Whitmore," she said softly. "That is not an answer." "It's the only one I have right now," Clara said. "Hand me that pillowcase." Margaret handed her the pillowcase. She stayed another 20 minutes and left, having said 3 more things Clara didn't respond to. And one thing, "You look less tired than you have in a year," that Clara carried inside with her when she went back to the kitchen, and did not take out and look at directly, but could feel the shape of in her apron pocket beside the note about corrections. That evening 3 new boarders arrived. A family, a man, his wife, and 2 small children, making their way to San Angelo, where the husband's brother had land. They were dusty and thin, and the children were quiet in the way children got quiet when they'd been traveling too long and hadn't had enough to eat. And Clara saw all of this in the first 30 seconds, and made her calculations accordingly. She put them in the big room upstairs, and told the husband the rate, which was honest. And then she went to the kitchen and stretched the supper she had been making for 2 into supper for 6, and she did it with what she had in the larder, which was for the first time in months, actually something. Ethan came in from the barn, washed his hands at the pump, and came to the kitchen door, and looked at the pots on the stove and looked at her. "How many?" he asked. "5 more," she said. Family. He looked at the pot. He looked at the larder shelf. Without a word he went back outside, and she heard him in the garden she had planted in April, and largely not had time to tend. She heard him moving through it, and when he came back he had onions and 2 handfuls of dried beans from the second row she had forgotten to harvest, and a bunch of dried herbs tied with kitchen string that she had hung in the garden shed and then also forgotten about. He set them on the work table. She looked at them. She looked at him. "I noticed the garden when I was fixing the fence," he said simply. She turned back to the stove. "Thank you," she said. They worked side by side in that kitchen for the next hour, without talking much, and what talking there was stayed practical. Past that more salt the cornbread's done, and Clara was aware with the part of her that stayed aware of everything. That this was the first time in 5 years she had shared a kitchen with someone who knew what they were doing in it, and that the awareness of it was doing something to her equilibrium that she needed to be careful about. The family ate well. The children stopped being quiet. The mother looked across the table at Clara, with the particular expression of a woman who recognized another woman's effort, and was not going to let it pass unnamed. "This is wonderful," she said. "Truly." "It's just supper," Clara said. "No, ma'am," the woman said. "It isn't." Ethan at the far end of the table did not say anything, but she saw his hand go still around his cup for a moment before he lifted it and drank. The town came at her on Saturday. Not all at once. In the way a wave comes, you see it building before it arrives, you can track it on the horizon, and the tracking does not make the impact any smaller. It started with Reverend Marsh himself, who appeared at the front door in the mid-morning with his hat and his considered expression, and the particular energy of a man who has decided something is his business and has arranged his justifications in advance. "Miss Clara," he said, "may I come in?" "Of course," she said. They sat in the front room, which she used for guests, and he held his hat, and she folded her hands in her lap and waited. "There is some concern in the community," he said, "about the arrangement you have with the man Callahan." "He's a boarder doing repair work," she said. "The same arrangement I've had with 3 other men in the past 2 years. The other men stayed 2 nights and left," Reverend Marsh said. "Mr. Callahan has been here 8 days. The repairs have taken 8 days," she said. "The east section of the roof required new joists. That is not a quick job. Clara." He leaned forward slightly. He had kind eyes, which was both his greatest quality and the most dangerous thing about him, because the kindness made the presumption feel like care. "You are a widow, an unmarried woman running a public house. The company of a single man for an extended period. Is a financial arrangement that has repaired my roof, replaced a fence post, reseated my barn door hinge, and kept my well rope from snapping." She kept her voice even. "I fail to see what moral weight those repairs carry, Reverend. It's not the repairs themselves." "What is it then?" He stopped. She waited. "People talk," he said finally. "I know they do," she said. "They've been talking since before my husband was in the ground. They said I couldn't keep the house running. I kept it running. They said I should sell to Harlan Boggs. I didn't sell. They said I was too proud to ask for help." She paused. "They were right about that one. I am. I'm working on it." She met his eyes. "Mr. Callahan is a decent man who is doing honest work for honest board. That is the full extent of what is happening here. If the community requires more information than that before it makes up its mind, I'm afraid I can't supply it." Reverend Marsh looked at her for a long moment, then he put his hat on. "You are a very difficult woman to have a pastoral concern about," he said. "I appreciate you coming," she said, and meant it. "I know you meant it kindly." He left. Clara sat in the front room for a moment after he was gone, her hands still folded in her lap, and thought about the word that had been building at the back of her throat for the past 8 days, the word she had been not saying with great precision and considerable effort. She did not say it now either. She got up and went back to work. But the wave, once it had started, did not stop with the Reverend. The twist came from a direction she hadn't watched. Harlan Boggs walked through her front door at 3 in the afternoon, and he wasn't alone. He had a man with him. A man Clara didn't recognize, well-dressed, younger than Boggs, with the particular kind of neatness that came from living in a city where you could be neat without effort. He carried a leather case. "Miss Clara," Boggs said pleasantly, "I hope I'm not intruding. This is Mr. Gerald Fitch from the Texas Land and Deed Office in Austin." Clara stood very still. "Mr. Fitch," she said. Fitch nodded with the neutral politeness of a man whose job required him to deliver bad news at regular intervals without taking sides in it. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I appreciate you receiving us." "I haven't agreed to receive you yet," she said. "What is this about?" Boggs smiled the way he always smiled, the smile that was not about warmth. "There's an issue with the deed to this property," he said. Mr. Fitch became aware of it in the course of researching the road corridor for the freight terminal project. He thought it best to bring it to your attention directly. "What issue?" she said. Fitch opened his leather case and took out a document. "Miss Whitmore, when your husband James Whitmore purchased this property in 1877, he filed the deed with the county recorder in Holt Creek. However, there appears to be an error in the original filing, a discrepancy in the land description that under the current interpretation of the state land code creates a cloud on the title." She looked at the document he held out. She took it. She read it. She was not a lawyer, but she had read enough documents in the course of keeping her ledger and managing the boarding house to understand the language when it was used plainly and to recognize when it was being used in a way that was plain and devastating at the same time. The discrepancy was real. She could see it, a surveyor's notation that didn't match the filed description by 11 feet on the south boundary. 11 feet that in 1877 had mattered to nobody. 11 feet that in the hands of a man with a leather case and a freight terminal project suddenly mattered a great deal. "What does this mean?" she said. "It means," Fitch said carefully, "that the title to this property is not clean. It would need to be resolved through a formal proceeding before the property could be transferred or before you could obtain any kind of secured credit against it." "Or," Boggs said, "it means that there is some question as to whether the filing was valid in the first place, which creates a situation where the property, Harlan." The voice came from behind them. They all turned. Ethan Callahan was standing in the doorway of the front room. He had sawdust on his shirt and the hammer still in his hand, and the particular quality of stillness that Clara had come to understand was not the absence of motion, but the presence of a decision being made behind very calm eyes. Boggs turned. Something moved across his face, not fear exactly, but the recalibration of a man who had walked into a room expecting it to be empty, and found it was not. "Mr. Callahan," Boggs said, "I didn't know you were here." "You knew," Ethan said. "Billy Marsh told me you asked about me in town 2 days ago. You wanted to know how long I was staying." The silence in the room had a new shape. Fitch looked at Boggs. Boggs looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at the document in Clara's hand. "Can I see that?" he said to her, quietly. She held it out. He crossed the room and took it and read it, and he read it the way she had read it, quickly, completely, without performance. His face did not change while he read it. He handed it back to Fitch. "The discrepancy is in the surveyor's notation," he said to Fitch, "not the deed itself." "They reference each other," Fitch said. Under the current code, a surveyor's error in a contemporaneous notation does not void a properly witnessed and filed deed," Ethan said. "It creates a question that is resolved by the deed, not by the notation." He looked at Boggs. "You know that. Mr. Fitch knows that. I expect you're both hoping Miss Whitmore doesn't know it." The silence now was a different kind entirely. Clara looked at Ethan. She looked at Boggs. She looked at the document. "Is that true?" she said to Fitch. Fitch had the grace to look uncomfortable. "There are interpretations on both sides," he said. "The question is not entirely settled." "Which means," Ethan said, "that if Miss Whitmore were to take this to a lawyer, a real one, not one working for the freight terminal project, she would be told that her title is fine." "It isn't quite that simple." "Then make it simple," Ethan said, "or leave." Boggs looked at him steadily. "You've got no standing here, Callahan. This is between Miss Whitmore and—" "I've got standing anywhere Miss Whitmore says I've got standing," Ethan said. He looked at Clara. "Do I have standing?" Everything in the room waited. Clara looked at Ethan Callahan, the sawdust on his shirt, the hammer in his hand, the absolute stillness of a man who was not performing anything but was simply entirely present in a way she was not accustomed to and was not sure she had the vocabulary for, and she made a decision she did not make with her head. "You have standing," she said. Ethan turned back to Boggs. "The lady has a boarding house to run," he said. "I believe you were leaving." Boggs held his gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he looked at Clara with the expression of a man who is replacing one approach with another. "The offer stands," he said. "When you're ready." "I won't be ready," she said. "Good day, Mr. Boggs." They left. The front door closed. Clara sat down in the nearest chair because her legs had made the same decision they'd made the day she heard about the joists. The decision to stop pretending the news wasn't heavy. Ethan sat down across from her. He set the hammer on the floor beside the chair. "How long has he been doing this?" Ethan said. "The deed thing is new," she said. "The offers have been coming for 2 years." "He manufactured the urgency," Ethan said. "Found the surveyor's notation, brought a man from Austin to make it look official. He was betting you'd panic and sell before you talked to anyone who knew the law." "That's a great deal of trouble to take over a boarding house," she said. "It's not about the boarding house," Ethan said. "It's about the road. You're sitting on 200 feet of the best frontage on the only direct route between the South Ranches and the rail at Abilene. A freight terminal there is worth 50 times what he'd pay you for the property." She looked at him. "How do you know about the road?" she said. "I drive cattle on it," he said. "I've been driving cattle through here for 6 years. I know every foot of this road." He paused. "I should have realized sooner what Boggs was after. I'm sorry I didn't." "You've been here 9 days," she said. "Still," he said. She looked at her hands. She looked at the chair Boggs had just vacated. She thought about 2 years and 11 cents and a surveyor's notation and a man who showed up with a leather case to make fear out of paperwork. "I need a lawyer," she said. "Yes," he said. "There's one in Red River Junction, Daniel Carr. He's honest. He handled a land dispute for a rancher I know, did it straight and didn't overcharge." "How far is Red River Junction?" "Half a day's ride." She looked at him. "I can't leave the boarding house," she said. "You've got a family upstairs," he said. "The Hendersons seem like decent people. I expect Mr. Henderson would keep an eye on things for a morning if you asked him." "You've already thought this through," she said. "I thought it through on the way from the barn when I heard Boggs's voice." He said, "I've had 9 days to learn how this house works. I used them." She looked at this man who had arrived as a problem and had continued without her authorization to arrange himself between her and every subsequent problem, and she thought about what Tobias had said about letting people in without noticing. She was noticing now. She was noticing in a way that was entirely inconvenient and several degrees warmer than anything she had allowed herself to notice in 5 years. "We leave at first light," she said. He nodded. She stood up. She smoothed her apron. She picked up the document Fitch had left and tucked it under her arm. "Mr. Callahan," she said. "Miss Clara, that was what you did just now." She stopped, started again. She was not a woman who struggled with words, and the struggling was itself information that she was not sure what to do with. "Thank you." He looked at her, not at the room, not past her, at her. "You didn't need me to do it," he said quietly. "You'd have gotten there yourself. I just shortened the road," she said. "Yes, ma'am." She held his gaze for a moment. "Don't make a habit of it," she said. He almost smiled. "I'll try." She went to the kitchen. She stood at the work table with her hands flat on the wood and breathed the way she breathed when something large had just happened, and she needed to stay in front of it, rather than letting it run her over from behind. Her title was intact. Her house was intact. And something else, something she could feel but not name, sitting in the center of her chest, like a coal that had been cold for 5 years and was starting to think about warmth that was a different kind of intact. Not whole. Not yet. But not broken anymore, in quite the way it had been before a man she didn't ask for walked in and called her stew inadequate, and then spent 9 days proving he understood the weight of what he'd said. Mr. Henderson agreed to watch the house. She told him it was a business matter in town and would take most of the morning. He was a practical man who asked practical questions and did not ask the impractical ones, which was exactly the quality she needed from him today. She was at the kitchen table that night reviewing the deed documents she had kept in the tin box in her bedroom, the box she had not opened in 2 years because the content of it had always been true, and she had told herself the truth didn't require revisiting when Ethan came to the kitchen doorway. "You ought to sleep," he said. "Long ride tomorrow." "I want to understand what I'm bringing to the lawyer," she said. "I don't walk into a room about my own property without knowing more about it than the man across the table." He looked at her. "Can I help?" She looked at the documents spread across the table. "Do you read deeds?" she said. "I've bought land," he said. "I've read enough of them." She moved over on the bench. He sat down beside her. They went through these documents together. The original deed, the survey notation, the filed record from the county recorder, and they talked about it in the practical language of 2 people examining a problem they needed to solve. And there was nothing in it that was anything other than practical, except for the fact that their shoulders were almost touching, and the lamp was between them. And once when she reached across him for the survey document, his hand came up as if it was going to help her reach it, and then stopped itself and settled back on the table. She noticed. She did not acknowledge that she noticed. "The deed is clean," he said, after they'd been through it twice. "Carr will tell you the same thing. Boggs was counting on you not knowing that." "He was counting on the fact that I've been alone a long time," she said. "People assume that a woman alone is a woman who has no one to help her read the fine print." "He assumed wrong," Ethan said. She looked at the documents. "He assumed correctly," she said quietly, "up until about 9 days ago." The words were out before she had decided to say them. She did not look at him, but she felt the shift in the air beside her, the particular quality of stillness that she had learned was Ethan Callahan's version of a strong reaction that he was being careful with. "Clara," he said. Her first name. "No, ma'am, just that." She looked up. His face was very close and very still, and the lamp was between them, and in his eyes was something she recognized because she had felt it in her own chest for 3 days now, and had been handling it with the same precision she handled everything that threatened to get ahead of her. "Don't," she said. Not cold, not sharp, just clear. He didn't move. "Why?" "Because I've managed this long," she said, "and I don't know yet what I'm managing toward. And I need to see the lawyer tomorrow, and I need to think clearly on the ride there, and I can't—" She stopped. She looked at the documents. She looked back at him. "I need a little more time," she said. "That's all." He looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said. He stood up. He gathered the documents into a neat stack and set them at the edge of the table where she could reach them in the morning. He picked up his coffee cup and carried it to the sink. He stopped at the kitchen door. "Clara," he said. She looked at him. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. 3 words that were also an answer to a question she had not asked out loud. She did not respond, but she did not tell him he was wrong either. He went upstairs. She sat at the kitchen table with the documents under her hands and the lamp burning low and the sound of the boarding house settling around her. The creak of old timber, the distant shift of horses in the yard. The particular quiet of a house that had people in it and was not for the first time, in a long time, empty in the way that mattered. She thought about the deed. She thought about Boggs and Fitch and a freight terminal that was coming whether she sold or not. She thought about 11 cents and full larders, and a man who walked through her house in the dark, counting what needed fixing, and did not once in 9 days make her feel like one of the broken things. She blew out the lamp. She went upstairs, and she lay in the dark and thought about a lawyer in Red River Junction and a document that said this land was hers, and a voice at her kitchen door that said, "I'm not going anywhere," and the fact that the coal she had thought was cold for good was throwing enough heat now that she could feel it from the inside. Morning was going to be a long ride. She was going to need her strength. She closed her eyes, and this time she slept without working at it. They left before the sun was fully up. Clara had the documents in a canvas satchel across her lap and her good bonnet on her head, which was the bonnet she saved for occasions that required her to be taken seriously, and she sat straight on the wagon bench. The way she sat straight through everything, not rigidly, but with the particular alignment of a woman who had learned that posture was sometimes the only armor available. Ethan drove. She had not asked him to drive. He had simply come around to the driver's side of the wagon and taken up the reins, and she had made the calculation that arguing about it would cost her more than accepting it, and she was conserving her energy for Red River Junction. They were 20 minutes down the road before either of them said anything. "Tell me about Daniel Carr," she said. "Honest man," Ethan said. 50 or so. Practiced in Austin before he came out here. He'll tell you the truth whether it's good news or not. That's the most important thing in a lawyer." "Has he handled land disputes against freight interests before?" Ethan looked at her sideways. "You've been thinking about this since before the sun came up." "I've been thinking about it since Boggs walked through my door," she said. "Tell me about Carr." "He handled a case 3 years ago. Rancher named Pritchett up near McCullough County. Railroad wanted his south pasture for a spur line. Sent men with documents that looked official and numbers that looked fair, and intentions that were neither." He paused. "Carr took the case for a flat fee and a share of the settlement. Pritchett kept his pasture. And the railroad? Found a different route, Ethan said, which they'd known about all along. Clara looked at the road ahead. Boggs knows about the freight road already, she said. He told me 2 years ago. He's been counting on me getting tired. People who count on a woman getting tired, Ethan said, tend not to understand the particular kind of tired that comes from surviving something. You don't get weak from that. You get enduring. She looked at him. He was watching the road, not her. That, she said, is a surprisingly precise observation for a man who drives cattle for a living. I've also been watching you for 10 days, he said. I pay attention. She turned back to the road. She paid attention to the fact that his watching her for 10 days had produced in her not the discomfort she would have expected, but something that sat closer to being seen than to being watched, and those were different things. And the difference between them was not something she was going to examine at 8 in the morning on a wagon bench half a day from Red River Junction. How did you learn about deeds? She said. My mother's house, he said. After she died, I wanted to make sure it stayed in the family. The lawyer we hired was not Daniel Carr. He was the other kind. He said it without bitterness, but the flatness in it was its own kind of feeling. I learned the hard way what questions to ask. Took me 2 years and more money than I had to untangle what he'd done. He paused. Ended up selling the house anyway. Wasn't enough of the family left to fill it. Clara was quiet. I'm sorry, she said. It was a long time ago, he said. That doesn't make it smaller, she said. He looked at her then briefly, with an expression she had not seen on him before, something open and unguarded that was gone as fast as it had appeared, replaced by the usual steadiness. But she had seen it. She filed it in the same place she filed everything she noticed that she wasn't ready to act on. They rode in silence for a while. Not an uncomfortable silence. The kind that had earned itself, the kind that came from two people who had spent 10 days in proximity close enough that the quiet between them had become familiar rather than tense. Daniel Carr's office was on the second floor of a 2-story building on the main street of Red River Junction, up a staircase that had seen better decades above a land surveyor's office, whose presence there struck Clara as either deeply ironic or perfectly appropriate, depending on how the morning went. Carr himself was a spare man with wire spectacles and ink-stained fingers, and the kind of face that had settled into permanent thoughtfulness, as if the thinking never fully stopped, even when everything else did. He shook Clara's hand before he shook Ethan's, which she noted, and he gestured for them to sit, and he put on his spectacles and read the documents she handed him without any preamble or small talk, which she appreciated. He read everything twice. The first reading took 8 minutes. The second took 5. He set the papers on his desk and looked at Clara over his spectacles. Your title is clean, he said. The breath that left her body had been held longer than she knew. I thought so, she said. Tell me why. Carr almost smiled. The deed was properly witnessed, properly notarized, and properly filed within the statutory period. The surveyor's notation is a contemporaneous document, but it is not part of the deed. It references the deed. The deed does not reference it. Under the 1876 Land Act, and every subsequent interpretation I'm aware of, a surveyor's notation error does not cloud a title that was correctly established. What Mr. Fitch told you is, and I want to be precise here, technically arguable in a way that a man who paid for the argument could sustain for some time in front of a sympathetic judge. But it would lose. How long would it take to lose? Ethan said. Carr looked at him. A year, maybe 18 months, depending on the judge and how aggressive Boggs wants to be. He looked at Clara. In the meantime, the cloud on the title would make it difficult to borrow against the property or to sell it, and the cost of defending it would be significant, Clara said. Yes. Clara looked at the documents. So the plan, she said slowly, was never to win the legal argument. It was to make the fight expensive enough that I'd sell to end it. That would be my reading of it, Carr said. It's a common approach. It works most often against people who are already financially stretched and who don't have access to counsel. He knew I didn't have access to counsel, Clara said. Most people in your position don't, Carr said. Not unkindly. She was quiet for a moment. Then, what can I do to make it stop? Carr leaned back in his chair. You can file a quiet title action. It's a proceeding that forces the question into court directly, rather than letting it sit as a cloud. It compels Boggs to either press his claim formally, which he'll lose, or abandon it. He paused. It's not without cost. My fee for the filing and the proceeding would be $40. $40. She kept her face still. She had 11 cents in her apron 8 days ago. The ledger was better than that now, but $40 was not a number that lived in her current reality. I don't have $40, she said, clearly. The way she had told Ethan she had 11 cents, because she had learned in the past 10 days that saying the true number to a person who was actually paying attention was more useful than protecting her pride with a softer figure. Carr nodded as if he had expected this. I occasionally take cases on deferred payment, he said, against the property value settled when the matter is resolved. I don't want the property used as security, she said immediately. I understand that. In this case, given the clarity of your title, I'd be willing to work on a fee-plus percentage basis. $20 up front and 5% of any damages we extract from Boggs for the fraudulent title challenge. She looked at him. There are damages, Ethan said. The presentation of a false cloud on title for the purposes of coercion is actionable. Carr said. If we can document that Mr. Fitch was operating on Boggs's instruction to manufacture urgency, and I suspect we can, there's a case for damages. Probably not large ones, but something. Clara looked at the documents on his desk. $20. She had enough barely if she counted the money she'd set aside for the October supply order. She would be short for October. She would manage October when it came. She had managed worse Octobers. File it, she said. Carr looked at her steadily. Miss Whitmore, Boggs will know within a week. He'll come at you harder before it gets easier. Are you prepared for that? Mr. Carr, she said. I've been prepared for that for 2 years. I was just waiting for the right moment and the right information. She met his eyes. I have both now. He picked up his pen. On the ride back, the afternoon light came at a low angle across the road, and the air had the dry warmth of a Texas summer settling toward evening, and Clara sat with the satchel across her lap and felt the weight of the morning sitting differently in her chest than it had on the way out, lighter, but not light, resolved in one direction, but open in another. $20, Ethan said after they'd ridden about 10 minutes. I have it, she said. I know you do, he said. I wasn't going to offer. She looked at him. You were going to tell me not to, he said. So I'm saving us both the time. She almost laughed. It was small and not quite complete, but it was closer to a real laugh than she had produced in front of another person in a very long time, and she felt it move through her like something being let loose from a held position. You're learning, she said. I had a good teacher, he said. Demanding, clear expectations. Excellent at telling me exactly where the line is. And do you stay on the right side of the line? He looked at her sideways. I'm working on it, he said. She looked at the road. She thought about the quiet title action and Carr's pen moving across the paper and the particular quality of the moment, when something you have been holding against pressure is finally officially held by something stronger than just yourself. Ethan? She said. He looked at her. First name again, she had not used it before, and she watched him register at that subtle adjustment in his posture that was not quite surprise, but was the thing that came just after. Thank you, she said, for knowing about Carr, for coming today. You would have found Carr on your own, he said. Eventually, she said, after Boggs had run me another 6 months around the track. She paused. You shortened the road again. I thought you told me not to make a habit of it. I did, she said. I'm amending my position. He looked at the road ahead and said nothing, but she saw his hands settle differently on the reins, The same shift she had learned to read as Ethan Callahan's version of something he was feeling that he did not have immediate words for. She was developing a vocabulary for his silences, the way she had developed the vocabulary for everything else in her life carefully, by paying attention. They got back to Holt Creek in the early evening. What they found when they pulled into the yard was not what Clara had left behind. Mr. Henderson was on the porch with his wife, and both of them were standing in the particular way that people stood when they were waiting for something, and hoping to postpone the moment they had to say it. Inside, Clara could hear voices more than she had left in the house. She was off the wagon before it had fully stopped. "What happened?" she said. Mrs. Henderson came forward. She was a round, warm woman who had been married long enough to acquire the practical compassion of a woman who had seen most varieties of human trouble and knew that the most useful thing to do with it was move toward it rather than away. "Nothing bad?" Mrs. Henderson said quickly. "Nothing that can't be handled. 3 families came in about 2 hours ago. The Callaway Pass Road washed out in the storm last week, and this is the only alternate route north. Word's gotten out that you take in travelers." Clara counted the horses in the yard. 18. 3 families. Children. Her mind went to the larder and came back with the same arithmetic it always did. Fast, honest, and presently discouraging. "How many in total?" she said. 14, Mrs. Henderson said. "Including 6 children. They've been polite and patient, but Clara..." She lowered her voice. "They're hungry. The smallest ones haven't eaten since morning." Clara was already moving toward the kitchen. "Mrs. Henderson," she said without turning back. "Will you start water on the big fire, Mr. Henderson? There's a side of bacon in the larder and dried beans on the second shelf. Start them soaking." "Yes, ma'am." Both of them said the unison of people who were relieved to have something specific to do. Clara came through the kitchen door and assessed the larder with the speed of a woman who had been doing this arithmetic her whole life. 14 people. 6 children. What she had. What she could stretch. What she would need that she did not have. Ethan was beside her. She did not tell him to be. He simply was. "Cornmeal's low," he said, looking at the same shelf she was looking at. "I know." "Henderson's general store will still be open," he said. "It's not past 6. "I know," she said. "I'll go," he said. "Ethan." Clara. Not asking, not telling. Just her name the way he'd learned to say it as if it meant something more than the sum of its letters. "Let me go." She looked at him. She thought about the ledger and the $20 she had just committed, and the October supply order she had sacrificed, and the 14 people in her front room, and the 6 children who had not eaten since morning. "Cornmeal," she said, "and whatever dried fruit he has. Children eat better when there's something sweet in it." He was out the door before she finished the sentence. She cooked. The Hendersons helped, and one of the traveling women, a capable-looking woman named Ruth, who came into the kitchen without being asked, and picked up a knife and started on the onions without introduction and without explanation, which Clara understood as the highest possible form of solidarity. And between the 3 of them, the kitchen became what it became when Clara was working at full capacity, something close to controlled and something close to warm. The children came to the kitchen doorway in the tentative way that children came to kitchens when they were hungry, and had been told not to ask one at a time, then in pairs drawn by the smell, the way small creatures were drawn by warmth. Clara gave each one a piece of cornbread the moment it came out of the pan. She did not make a ceremony of it. She simply handed it to each child as they appeared warm and plain, and enough to take the edge off while the rest finished cooking. The smallest one, a girl of maybe 4, with dark eyes, and her hair coming loose from its braid, took the cornbread in both hands and looked up at Clara and said, "Thank you, ma'am." Clara crouched down. "You're very welcome," she said. "You sit right outside this door where I can see you, and when supper's ready, I'll tell you first." The girl's face opened like something that had been held closed too long. She went and sat exactly where Clara had told her. Ruth at the counter said nothing, but Clara saw her press her lips together briefly in the way women pressed their lips together when something had hit them squarely, and they were choosing not to make a sound about it. Ethan was back in 20 minutes with cornmeal and dried apricots and a jar of honey he had added without being asked. Clara looked at the honey. "Henderson was going to throw it out anyway," Ethan said. "The lid's cracked." "It isn't," she said. "No," he admitted. "It isn't." She put the honey on the work table and went back to the stove. The supper she put out that night was the best meal the Whitmore boarding house had produced in 5 years. This was not because the ingredients were exceptional. They weren't. They were the ingredients of a working larder combined with enough dried apricot and honey to give the cornbread a sweetness that made the children eat 3 pieces each, and enough care in the seasoning of the beans that 2 of the traveling men asked her what she put in it, and she told them dried sage and patience, and they didn't know whether she was joking, and she wasn't entirely. The dining table was too small for 14 people, so they spread into the front room, and the sound that filled the boarding house was a sound Clara had almost forgotten. The specific texture of the layered sound of many people eating and talking, and the particular pitch of children's voices when the hunger has been addressed, and the relief has set in, and the sounds they make become something closer to play. She stood in the kitchen doorway and listened to it. Ethan appeared beside her. He did not say anything. Neither did she. They stood in the doorway and listened to the sound of her house being full, and the feeling in Clara's chest was too large and too complicated to name, so she did not try to name it. She simply stood in it the way you stood in weather, accepting the full fact of it on your skin. "You should eat," he said quietly. "I will," she said. "Clara." He said it the way he'd learned to say it, and she turned to look at him, and he was looking at her with that open, careful attention that she had stopped trying to deflect and had started cautiously to simply receive. "Sit down," he said. "Let me bring you a plate." She opened her mouth. "It's not charity," he said before she could say it. "It's supper. Let someone bring you supper." She sat down at the kitchen table. He brought her a plate. He sat across from her with his own, and they ate in the kitchen while the noise of the full house moved around them, and it was the most ordinary thing in the world, and also the most extraordinary thing that had happened to Clara Whitmore in 5 years, and she was aware of both of those facts simultaneously, and doing her level best to hold them without breaking either one. The twist came the next morning. It came as the worst things did through the front door, and wearing a pleasant expression. Clara was clearing the breakfast dishes when she heard the knock and then heard Mrs. Henderson, who had stayed to help with the families, open the door, and then heard a voice she recognized. The county recorder's office, a man named Purcell, whom she had met twice and found sufficient both times, and then Mrs. Henderson's voice saying she would get Miss Whitmore. Clara set down the dishes and went to the front room. Purcell was a bureaucratic man, in the specific sense that he was not a bad man, but had organized his personality around the avoidance of judgment, so that whatever he was the instrument of, he delivered with the same neutral efficiency, which made him difficult to read and occasionally infuriating. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I apologize for the early call. I have a document for you from the county recorder's office." He held it out. She took it. She read the first paragraph, and the feeling that moved through her was cold and fast, and she recognized it as the feeling she had when the joists turned out to be rotted, the feeling of finding the worst news inside, the news you already had. It was a formal notice. Harlan Boggs had filed a competing claim on the south boundary, 11 feet of the Whitmore property, citing the surveyor's notation discrepancy. He had moved faster than she had. He had beaten her to the county recorder by 16 hours. "What does this mean?" she said. She knew, but she needed to hear it from someone official. "It means a formal boundary dispute has been initiated," Purcell said. "It will go before a county judge. Until it's resolved, certain transactions relating to the property." "I know what it means," she said. She looked at the document. She thought about Carr and the quiet title action and the $20 she had paid yesterday morning and the 18 hours between her filing and Boggs's filing, and she thought about Boggs knowing she had gone to Red River Junction and using the time she was away to move. She thought about someone telling him she had gone. "Purcell," she said. "When was this filed?" "Yesterday afternoon," he said. "Around 3 o'clock. She had still been on the road to Red River Junction at 3 o'clock yesterday afternoon. Boggs had known she was gone before she got there. She stood very still and let the implications of that arrange themselves into order. Someone in Holt Creek had told Boggs she was riding to Red River Junction. Someone who had known early enough that Boggs had time to file before she could get back. Someone who was either in his pocket or who had mentioned it casually to someone who was. Mrs. Pratt. She thought of Mrs. Pratt's face the morning she had arrived in the kitchen talking about selling to Boggs. The interest she had shown in the boarding house's affairs. The questions she had asked about the repairs about the border, about Clara's plans. Clara had not told Mrs. Pratt she was going to Red River Junction, but she had told Reverend Marsh, on Saturday when he came with his pastoral concern. She had told him she needed a lawyer, and he had nodded with the gravity of a man who was listening for more reasons than the one being offered. She had told him. She pressed the document flat against her side and looked at Purcell. "Is Daniel Carr's filing on record?" she said. "I'd have to check." "I need you to check," she said. "Today." "Miss Whitmore, the office procedure." "Purcell." She looked at him with the full, direct, undiluted attention of a woman who had run out of patience for procedure. "A man who has been trying to force me off my property for 2 years has filed a fraudulent boundary claim using information that I believe was given to him by someone who knew my movements. I filed a quiet title action yesterday morning in Red River Junction that should supersede his claim. I need to know if that filing is on record before I do anything else. Can you check today, or do I need to go to the judge directly?" Purcell blinked. "I'll check today," he said. "Thank you." He left. Clara stood in the front room with the document in her hand and the noise of the families packing up to leave floating down from upstairs, and the sound of Ethan's hammer starting up again outside. Back to the list, back to the porch. Step, back to the work, and she made herself breathe at a pace that matched her thinking rather than her feelings. She went outside. "Ethan." The hammer stopped. He looked down at her from the porch where he was working. She held up the document. He came down. He read it, fast. His face did not change while he read it, but she saw the quality of his stillness shift into the kind that preceded action rather than thought. "Someone told him?" she said. "Yes. I think it was Reverend Marsh," she said. "Not maliciously. I think he mentioned it to someone. I think Boggs has someone in the community who feeds him information, and it went from Marsh to that person, and from that person to Boggs in less time than it took us to get to Red River Junction." Ethan folded the document. "Carr's filing should be on record," he said. "It was filed first." "Purcell is checking." "Good." He looked at her. "Clara, this is Boggs panicking. He found out you were getting counsel, and he moved the only piece he had left to move. A competing claim based on that notation would have to go before a judge who will look at the dates and look at Carr's filing and look at Boggs's claim and see exactly what this is." "You sound very certain," she said. "I'm certain Boggs overplayed his hand," Ethan said. "Men who've been winning easy for a long time do that when the game changes. They mistake the pattern for the outcome." He paused. "The game changed the day you filed." She looked at the document in his hand. Then she looked at him. "Come inside," she said. "I need to write a letter to Carr, and I need it to go out on the morning stage." They went inside. She wrote the letter at the kitchen table while Ethan sat across from her and read the competing claim document, carefully turning it over, looking at the dates. And she wrote with the controlled urgency of a woman who was angry in the specific way that was most useful. Not hot enough to cloud the language, but warm enough to drive every word forward. She sealed the letter. She handed it to Ethan. "Morning stage leaves at 7, she said. "From Henderson's. I'll make sure it's on it," he said. He looked at the letter in his hand and then at her. "You know this is going to get worse before it gets better," he said. "When Carr responds to the competing claim, Boggs will know the filing was already on record, and he'll know his claim is dead. He'll be looking for another way at you." "I know," she said. "And you're not going to sell." "No," she said. "And you're not going to stop the boarding house." "No." "And you're not going to leave Holt Creek." "No." she said. "I built something here. It took me 5 years and cost me more than I can put in the ledger. I'm not leaving." She looked at him steadily. "Are you—" The question was out before she had decided to ask it, and she watched it land in his face. Watched the thing that moved through him when she said it clear and direct, and without the careful hedging she usually wrapped around the things that mattered most to her. He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "I'm not." She looked at him. He looked at her. The kitchen was warm from the breakfast fire, and outside the families were finishing their packing, and the morning was moving around them both, and in between them was the same thing that had been there since the night she found him in the kitchen in the dark, grown larger now with every day and not going anywhere, regardless of what either of them called it or didn't call it. "Ethan," she said. "Clara." "The porch step," she said. "Second one from the top." He looked at her. "Someone's going to go through it," she said. A breath of something came out of him. Half laugh, half release, and the steadiness in his face broke open just enough for her to see what was underneath it, which was warm and certain, and had been there, she suspected, since approximately the second night. "I'll fix the porch step," he said. He got up, he took the letter, he went to the door. "Ethan!" He stopped. She looked at her hands on the table. She looked up at him. "When this is settled," she said carefully, "when Carr has dealt with Boggs and the title is clean and the claim is gone," she stopped, started again. "I would like to have a conversation about what comes next." She met his eyes. "For the house." He looked at her for a long moment. "For the house," he said. "And other things," she said. Quietly, exactly as clearly as she meant it. The thing that happened to his face then was not the half-smile she had come to recognize. It was the real thing, full and unhurried, and entirely his, and she felt it move through her chest with the specific warmth of something that had been coming for a long time, and was no longer being asked to wait. "I'll be here," he said. He left. Clara sat at the kitchen table in the warm morning light, and listened to the last of the traveling families say their goodbyes in the front room, and listened to Ethan's boots on the porch steps. Careful, deliberate, counting the ones that still held, and she looked at her ledger, and at the boarding house walls, and at the hands that had kept this place standing through 5 years of things that had tried to bring it down. She thought about Boggs and his competing claim, and the judge who was going to look at the dates and see exactly what it was. She thought about Reverend Marsh and Mrs. Pratt, and the way Holt Creek talked, and always had, and always would, and how the talking had never once stopped the sun from coming up. She thought about a man at her kitchen door saying, "I'm not going anywhere," and meaning it with the particular kind of meaning that did not require repetition. She opened the ledger. In the column where she tracked the state of things, she wrote the date. Below the date, she wrote, "Quiet title filed. Competing claim received. Letter dispatched to D. Carr." She paused. Then she wrote one more thing. "Roof holds." She closed the ledger. Outside, the hammer started up again on the second step from the top of the back porch even, and steady in the morning air, and the boarding house moved around Clara Whitmore, the way a house moved when it had people in it, and food on the stove, and work being done in the yard, not like a place waiting to be lost, but like a place that had decided it was going to stay. The same decision she had made 5 years ago. The same decision she made again right now in the warm kitchen with the ledger closed under her hands. The same decision she intended to keep making every morning for as long as the road ran north, and the house stood and the work needed doing. Which she was beginning to understand was going to be for a very long time. Daniel Carr's response arrived on a Wednesday. Clara was in the kitchen when she heard the stage horn, and she dried her hands and went to the front porch and waited, because she had learned over the past 3 weeks that waiting on the porch was more honest than pretending she wasn't waiting at all. Ethan was at the south fence, replacing the last of the rotted posts, and he looked up when he heard the horn too, and their eyes met across the yard, with the particular quality of two people who were waiting for the same thing, and had agreed without saying so to wait for it together. The letter came through Henderson's store the way all her letters did. She opened it on the porch, She read it standing. Then she sat down on the front step, the repaired front step, solid under her now, and read it again. Ethan was beside her before she finished the second reading. She had not heard him cross the yard. He had simply appeared the way he appeared at the moments that mattered, without announcement and without being asked. She handed him the letter. He read it. His face did not change while he read it, but she saw the tension in his jaw release in the way it released when something resolved cleanly. Carr filed the response to the competing claim, he said. The date of the quiet title action is on record. Boggs's filing came 6 hours after. 6 hours, she said. The judge will dismiss the competing claim, Ethan said. That's what Carr is telling you. It's over. She looked at the letter in his hands. Over. She turned the word over in her mind, the way you turned a stone over, checking the underside, making sure what it said on the surface was what it said all the way through. He also says Boggs's counsel has already contacted him, she said, quietly, asking if Miss Whitmore would consider a settlement. Ethan looked up. What kind of settlement? Boggs will withdraw the competing claim and pay Carr's legal fees. She paused. In exchange for right of first refusal, if I ever choose to sell. Ethan was quiet. She looked at him. What do you think? She said. And she meant it not the reflexive politeness of asking someone's opinion before doing what you'd already decided, but the genuine inquiry of a woman who had learned in 3 weeks that this man's thinking was worth engaging with rather than routing around. I think right of first refusal is worth almost nothing to you and almost everything to Boggs, Ethan said. It's a long reach for a man whose hand just got slapped. He knows the claim is dead and he's trying to salvage something. That's what I thought, she said. What are you going to do? She took the letter back from him. She folded it along its original crease. I'm going to write to Carr and tell him the answer is no, she said. No settlement, no right of first refusal. The claim gets dismissed and that's the end of it. Boggs can build his freight terminal on whatever land he can find that isn't mine. Ethan looked at her for a moment. All right, he said. All right, she repeated. She stood up. She looked at him standing at the foot of the step she had told him someone was going to go through, and which he had fixed so soundly that she had stopped thinking about it within 24 hours of the repair, which was exactly what a good repair did. Come inside, she said. I'll make coffee and write the letter, and then I want to talk about the garden. The garden, he said. It's been neglected, she said, since April. The second row has given everything it's going to give, and I want to put in fall crops. Turnips and winter squash, maybe sweet potatoes if the ground will take it. She was already moving toward the door. I need another set of hands. She heard him follow her. She heard behind the sound of his boots on the porch steps, the small exhale of breath that was his version of the almost smile she had come to read as fluently as print. She wrote the letter to Carr and gave it to Ethan to take to Henderson's for the morning stage, and while he was gone, she started on the turnip beds because the ground was not going to turn itself, and she had been putting it off for 2 weeks while the legal situation occupied the front of her mind. She was on her knees in the garden when Mrs. Pratt came through the gate. Clara had been expecting this, not Mrs. Pratt specifically, but someone. Holt Creek had been watching the proceedings with the particular intensity of a small town that understood that what happened to Clara Whitmore's property had implications for how things worked around here, and word of Boggs's retreat would have moved through the town faster than weather. Someone was going to come to see how she was taking it. Mrs. Pratt was simply the most reliable vehicle for town sentiment in either direction. Clara, Mrs. Pratt said. She stopped when she saw the garden. You're gardening? I'm gardening. Clara agreed without looking up from the turnip bed. I heard about the legal matter, Mrs. Pratt said. I expect you did. Boggs withdrew the claim. A pause. People are saying you beat him. The law beat him, Clara said. I just made sure the law had the right information. Mrs. Pratt was quiet for a moment. Clara heard her move the small sound of a woman repositioning herself around a conversation she had planned differently. The man Callahan, she said. He's still here. He is. Clara. The voice changed. Softer now. Less civic. More human. What is he to you? Clara sat back on her heels and looked up at Mrs. Pratt with the full, even attention she gave to questions that deserved real answers. He's someone who showed me, she said carefully, that letting someone help you isn't the same as needing them to save you. She paused. That's not a small thing, Adeline. It took me 5 years to understand the difference. Mrs. Pratt looked at her. Something moved across the older woman's face that Clara did not expect. Not the sharpness of judgment, or the warmth of approval, but something older than either. Something that looked like recognition. James would have liked him, Mrs. Pratt said quietly. Clara looked at her garden. Yes, she said. I think he would have. Mrs. Pratt left 10 minutes later without having said a single thing. Clara would need to spend the rest of the day not thinking about which was so unusual that Clara filed it as evidence that people were capable of surprising you regardless of how long you'd known them. Ethan came back from Henderson's and found her still in the garden and crouched down at the edge of the bed without being asked, and picked up the second trowel she had brought out on the instinct that she would not be working alone, and they turned the fall bed together for an hour without talking much. And what talking there was stayed in the easy register of two people who had gotten past the work of knowing each other and into the simpler country on the other side of it. Tobias sent a letter, Ethan said after a while. Clara looked up. When came with your letter from Carr. I forgot to mention it. He reached into his shirt pocket and handed her a folded piece of paper. She opened it. The handwriting was young and effortful. Each letter placed with care, which told her the letter had been drafted more than once. Dear Miss Clara, I am writing to say I got back to the ranch and my arm is healed up right, like you said it would be. I told the boss what you told me to tell him about taking it slow, and he said he understood, which I don't think he did, but he let me take it easy for 2 more weeks, which was what you said I needed. I want you to know that I will not forget what you did. There are people who help you because they have to, and people who help you because they don't have to, and you are the second kind. And that is not something I will forget. Your friend, Tobias Wren. P.S. I told Mr. Callahan's man Billy that Mr. Callahan was at your place when he passed through. He said that was the best news he'd heard in 6 months, and that Ethan had finally gotten his head on straight. I did not know what that meant, but I thought you might. Clara read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in her apron pocket. What does it say? Ethan asked. That Billy thinks you've gotten your head on straight, she said. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Billy has been saying that, or the opposite of it, for 12 years, he said. It's the only 2 things he ever says. Which has he said more? A pause. The opposite, Ethan said. Clara looked at him. He was looking at the turned earth with the expression of a man who has said something true and is waiting to see how it lands. Ethan, she said. He looked at her. I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer me honestly, she said. When have I answered you any other way? Never, she said. Which is why I'm asking. She sat back on her heels fully and looked at him across the garden bed. The Garland Company, your route. The life you had before you walked into my dining room. She paused. Is this? She stopped. Started again with the precision she brought to things that mattered. Are you here because you feel you owe me something, or are you here because you want to be here? He looked at her for a long moment. The afternoon was warm, and the garden smelled of turned earth, and the distant sound of a wagon on the road carried across the yard and faded. I was here because I owed you something, he said, for the first 2 days. He set down his trowel. He looked at her directly. After that, I was here because I woke up every morning and the thought of leaving was... He stopped, tried again. It felt like the wrong direction, like a man walking away from water when he's thirsty. He paused. I've been doing this work for 20 years, Clara. I know what it feels like to be somewhere I'm supposed to pass through and somewhere I'm supposed to stop. He held her gaze. This is the second kind. She looked at him. She had been holding something for 3 weeks, with the careful deliberateness she brought to fragile things, holding it at arm's length, assessing it from every angle, checking it for the structural weaknesses she had learned to look for in the years since James died, and left her understanding that the things she loved could be taken. She put it down now. Not because she had stopped being careful, but because she had checked it thoroughly enough to know it would hold. "I'm not an easy woman to be around," she said. "I have opinions about everything. I keep a ledger on human behavior the same way I keep one on the finances. I will tell you when you're wrong, and I will expect you to tell me the same. I don't ask for help easily, and I probably never will." She paused. "And I will not sell this boarding house. Not to Boggs, not to anyone. This is mine, and I built it, and it's staying." Ethan looked at her steadily throughout all of this. "I know," he said. "Those aren't small things," she said. "No, ma'am," he agreed. "They're not." He picked up his trowel. "You forgot one." She frowned. "What?" "You give away your last bowl of food to a man who doesn't deserve it," he said, "and then you stand there and let him call it insufficient without explaining yourself." He looked at her. "You're also the most stubborn person I have ever met. And I was raised by a woman who once argued with a circuit judge for 40 minutes about the price of lumber." Clara looked at him. Then she laughed. A real one this time, full and unguarded, the kind she hadn't produced in front of another human being in so long that the sound of it surprised her almost as much as it seemed to surprise him. His face opening into something she had not seen on it before. A kind of uncomplicated joy, as if the laugh was something he had been waiting for and was relieved to finally hear. "Your mother sounds like a sensible woman," Clara said. "She was the best person I ever knew," he said. "Until recently." She looked at him. The afternoon held them both for a moment warm and still. "Come to supper," she said. "We'll talk about the garden after." "And the other things," he said. "And the other things," she said. The hearing happened on a Thursday 3 weeks later. Daniel Carr came from Red River Junction himself, which Clara had not asked him to do, and which cost him a day's travel, and when she said so, he told her that some cases were worth attending in person, and this was one of them. And she understood that what he meant was not that the case was legally complex, but that he wanted to be there when it resolved, which told her something about Daniel Carr that she filed beside what she already knew about him. The county judge was a man named Aldous Webb, who had been on the bench in Holt Creek for 11 years, and who had the specific quality of fairness that came not from idealism, but from having seen enough human behavior to be thoroughly unimpressed by the varieties of dishonesty people brought before him. Boggs was there with his own lawyer. Fitch was there too in the back, with the expression of a man who knew exactly how this was going to go, and had decided the most dignified available position was to appear to be simply present rather than implicated. Clara sat at the table beside Carr. Ethan sat in the gallery behind her. She did not look back at him. She did not need to. She could feel him there the way you felt a solid wall at your back, not constraining, just present. Just there. Judge Webb read both filings. He read them with the thoroughness of a man who was going to be able to say afterward that he had read everything which she appreciated. Then he looked at Boggs's lawyer. "Counsel," he said, "the quiet title action filed by Miss Whitmore in Red River Junction on August 14th is on record. The competing boundary claim filed by your client was received at this office on August 14th at 3:17 in the afternoon. The quiet title filing was received at 8:42 in the morning." He set the papers down. "I'm going to give you an opportunity to tell me something that changes what those numbers mean." Boggs's lawyer was a competent man in an impossible position, and he knew it. He said what competent men in impossible positions said. He argued the substance of the surveyor's notation. He argued the interpretive ambiguity of the land code. He used the word arguably 4 times in 6 minutes, which was the verbal signature of a man who knew his argument was going to lose, but was billing by the hour. Judge Webb listened. When the lawyer finished, the judge looked at Carr. "Mr. Carr." Carr stood. "The notation error is a contemporaneous surveyor's document that references the deed. The deed does not reference it." Under the 1876 Land Act, Section 14, Paragraph 3, a notation error of this kind does not constitute a defect in a properly witnessed and filed title. The quiet title action filed by my client resolves any ambiguity in her favor. Mr. Boggs's competing claim filed 6 hours after that action was on record has no standing. He paused. I'd also note for the record that Mr. Boggs has made 4 purchase offers to Miss Whitmore in the past 2 years, all of which were declined, and that the timing and nature of this boundary claim arising immediately after Miss Whitmore sought legal counsel suggests a purpose other than genuine title clarification. Boggs's lawyer was on his feet. Counsel is characterizing my client's— Sit down, Judge Webb said. He sat down. Webb looked at Boggs directly. Boggs met his gaze with the confidence of a man who had been in rooms like this before and had usually come out better than he went in. This was not going to be one of those times. The competing boundary claim is dismissed, Webb said. The quiet title action filed by Miss Clara Whitmore is confirmed. The property at the Whitmore boarding house, Holt Creek, Texas, is fully and cleanly titled in her name. He looked at both lawyers. If Mr. Boggs has further interest in properties along this road, I'd suggest he pursue them through channels that don't involve manufactured urgency and documents designed to alarm a woman into selling against her interest. He picked up his gavel. We're done. The gavel came down. Clara sat at the table and put both hands flat on the wood surface and breathed exactly once, slowly and completely from the bottom of her lungs. Then, Carr touched her arm. Congratulations, Miss Whitmore, he said. It's yours. She looked at him. It was always mine, she said. Yes, ma'am, he agreed. It was. She turned. Ethan was standing at the gallery rail. He was looking at her the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching, with the full, unguarded attention of a man who had stopped managing what his face showed sometime in the last 3 weeks and had not started again. She held his gaze across the room. She nodded once. He nodded back. That was all. It was enough. Boggs pushed through the gallery door without looking at her, which was the most honest thing he'd done since walking into her front room with Gerald Fitch and a leather case. His lawyer followed. Fitch followed the lawyer. The door closed behind them. Clara stood. Outside the courthouse, Carr shook her hand and Ethan's hand and told her he'd send the final paperwork within the week, and then he was gone, and Clara and Ethan stood on the street in the Holt Creek afternoon with the whole business settled and the sun overhead and the boarding house 8 minutes away. Well, she said. Well, he said. They looked at each other. I have turnips to plant, she said. I've got a barn door hinge that's still not sitting right, he said. I reset it twice and it's doing something I don't like. Then we'd better get back, she said. They walked to the wagon. She climbed up. He climbed up. He took the reins. She did not argue about the reins. They drove back through Holt Creek in the afternoon light, and people on the street watched them pass. The way people in small towns watch things that had become part of the story the town was telling about itself, and Clara looked straight ahead, and Ethan drove straight and steady, and neither of them felt the need to comment on the watching, because they had both in their own way stopped managing how things looked and started managing how things were. The boarding house came into sight at the end of the road. Clara looked at it the way she had looked at it every evening for 5 years, the timber and the patched walls, and the sign that had faded and been relettered twice, and the garden that was now half-turned for fall, and the porch steps that held now without complaint, and the roof that did not let in the sky anymore. She looked at it, and she felt what she always felt when she saw it, which was the particular combination of exhaustion and ownership and love that had no cleaner name than home. It looks different, Ethan said. She looked at him. It looks the same as it always has. No, he said. He was looking at the house too. It looked like it was holding on when I rode in. Now it looks like it's staying. She looked at the house. She thought about the difference between those two things, holding on and staying, and she thought about how long she had been doing the first one, and how it had felt like strength because she had nothing to compare it to, and how she understood now that staying was something different. Staying was what you did when the holding on was over. When the fight had been won, not with a dramatic gesture, but with a deed filing and a judge's gavel, and a woman who knew the true number in the ledger and wasn't afraid to say it out loud. Ethan pulled the wagon into the yard and set the brake, and she climbed down and he climbed down, and they stood in the yard with the boarding house in front of them and the garden behind them and the afternoon cooling toward evening. "Ethan," she said. "Clara." "Ask me," she said. He looked at her. She looked back at him. He understood. She saw the moment he understood, saw it move through him from the chest outward, unhurried, certain the way everything he was certain about moved. "Clara Whitmore," he said. "I came into your dining room, a tired and difficult man, and said something at your table that I'm going to spend a long time making up for. I've been here 32 days, and in those 32 days, I have not once wanted to be anywhere else." He paused. "I am asking you if you'll have me to let this be where I stay." She looked at him. She thought about the bowl of thin stew, and the note about corrections, and the roof, and the joists, and the well rope, and the lawyer in Red River Junction, and the judge's gavel, and 32 days of a man who said what he meant, and did what he said, and looked at her, not at her circumstances, not at what she needed, not at what he could offer, but at her. "You'll eat what I put in front of you," she said, without comment. His mouth moved. "Yes, ma'am. You'll tell me when I'm wrong," she said. "Every time, not when it's convenient." "Yes, ma'am." "And you'll understand," she said, "that this boarding house is mine, that it will always be mine, that nothing about that changes." "Clara," he said it firmly, clearly. "I wouldn't want it any other way." She looked at him for one more moment, the last moment of the distance she had been keeping, which had served her well and had earned its retirement. "Then yes," she said, "you can stay." He stepped forward. She let him. His hand came up and took hers, not dramatically, not with ceremony. Just his hand around hers, the way a man held something he intended to keep, and she felt the warmth of it go all the way to the place in her chest that had been cold for 5 years and was cold no longer. They stood in the yard of the Whitmore boarding house as the evening came in over the Texas plain, and there was nothing left to fight, and nothing left to hold off, and the house behind them was clean titled, and roof solid, and full of the particular quiet that good places had when the day was done, and the work was done, and the people in them had finally stopped surviving long enough to simply be. That night Clara made supper. She made it the way she made everything, with full attention and without wasted motion, with the ingredients she had and the skill she'd built over 35 years of feeding people who needed to be fed. She made it for the 3 families who were passing through, and for Ethan, and for herself, and the table was full in the way it had been full that night 3 weeks ago when the traveling families came through after the Callaway Pass road washed out, not just with food, but with sound, with the particular warm noise of people gathered in a place that had made room for them. Ethan sat at the far end of the table. When she set the bowl in front of him, he looked at it. Then he looked at her. "Is it better than the first one?" she asked. He looked at the bowl. He looked at her. He picked up his spoon. "No," he said. She raised her eyebrows. "The first one," he said quietly, "was the most important meal I ever ate." He held her gaze. "Everything I needed to know about who you are was in that bowl, and I was too proud and too tired and too much of a fool to see it." He paused. "I see it now." She looked at him. The table moved around them, the voices, the children, the sound of spoons and bread, and the warm, ordinary life of a house that was sheltering people, the way it had always been built to do. And in the middle of all of it was Clara Whitmore, who had been called a tired widow, and a woman who couldn't let go, and a woman too proud to ask for help, and who was in fact none of those things. She was a woman who had built something real in hard ground, and had kept it standing through 5 years of drought and debt and loneliness, and the particular kind of invisible war that powerful men waged against women who refused to be moved. She had won. Not because someone rescued her, not because she finally broke and asked for saving, but because she had known her own worth all along, Even in the nights when the ledger was desperate, and the larder was empty, and the town was talking, and the roof was letting in the sky, and she had held that knowledge like a coal in cupped hands against the wind, keeping it lit through everything, until the day the right person looked at her the right way, and finally saw what had been there the whole time. The man who had called her supper insufficient sat at her full table in her clean-titled home and looked at her with the eyes of someone who understood down to the bone exactly what it had cost her to put that first bowl in front of him. And the woman who had given away her last portion without a word looked back at him and understood that she would never be invisible again. Not to him, not to herself, not ever again. The Whitmore boarding house stood at the edge of Holt Creek for many years after that evening, and the road north stayed busy and the table stayed full, and the ledger, for the first time in a long time, showed more in the right column than the left. And the woman who had once been described as a tired widow with nothing left to give turned out to have had everything all along. She had simply been waiting for someone worthy enough to receive it.